Hi everyone, thanks for returning. Let's unravel another horrible case, the case of Teresa Ann Pullman. The story focuses on the reunion of a mother and daughter after nearly 20 years apart. The daughter is curious about their separation, her mother's absence, and the reason for her return. These are challenging questions that need to be answered, unfortunately. Their reunion is not a happy one and unexpectedly leads to a brutal murder as the police discover the body and begin their investigation. They uncover the victim's troubled past. But did the victim really deserve the fate she met? The events unfold on a summer evening at Funk Grove, a local nature reserve that attracts many visitors. Just after 6 p.m., a couple discovers a suspicious object in the grass near a walking path. As they approach, they realize it is a body lying on the ground. They quickly called the police and reported the incident. When the police arrived, they discovered the body was a woman. Her chest and neck had multiple cuts, and her face was disfigured beyond recognition. The body was sent for an autopsy to gather more details about the death. And initial examinations showed that the woman had been lying on the lawn for less than a day and likely died from blood loss due to severe injuries. The criminal acted quickly. There were no signs of a struggle on the victim's body. Forensic experts arrived at the scene and began their investigation. Their first task was to determine whether the victim was killed at that location or if her body had been moved there after death to conceal the crime. They observed no signs of a struggle nearby. The lawn looked undisturbed, however. They discovered a flattened lawn, suggesting that the victim had likely been dragged to the scene. The absence of her personal belongings suggested that a robbery had occurred, leading to her fatal injuries. The victim's face was too badly damaged to be identified, but she had a tattoo on her shoulder that read, "Lady Leo." This was the only clue the police had at the time. Toxicology tests found traces of illegal drugs in her system, further complicating matters and leading to local drug dealers as potential suspects. The body was likely dragged from the parking lot near the entrance to the reserve, which was the closest car entry point to the area. After finding no evidence near the body, the police expanded their search to the parking lot, where they discovered cigarette butts and bloodstains. A lighter found at the scene may be the only important clue to move the investigation forward, but it could also belong to someone who had nothing to do with the crime. These items need to be tested. The materials were then sent to a lab, where they confirmed that the blood found in the parking lot belonged to the victim. This showed that the police were on the right track. They also needed to analyze all the DNA evidence collected, including the many cigarette butts found in the parking lot. This analysis could take up to 8 weeks, but the police needed to keep moving forward and not waste time. The longer the investigation took, the greater the risk of losing potential evidence. It was odd that the attacker would choose such a busy location to leave the body. The trail was frequented by locals and tourists. Especially in the summer, the criminal's actions reminded police of serial killers who taunt law enforcement by leaving evidence and bodies in plain sight. This raised concerns that the attacker might strike again. It was important to locate the nearest surveillance cameras and the routes into the parking lot. However, the body had been in the woods for at least 13 hours along a busy road that had been traveled by many vehicles. The investigation would be very difficult. The police decided to change their strategy. They needed to identify the woman found in the woods. They searched the local missing persons database for recent reports, but found no matches. They then expanded their search to include reports from the previous month, but were still unsuccessful. While awaiting the results of the medical examiner's examination, the full autopsy report was released. It found that the victim had been stabbed multiple times in the neck and chest during the attack. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation and blunt force trauma. There are also signs of abuse to expedite the investigation. The sheriff decided to ask the public for help. A photo of the victim's tattoo was shared with the community via television and print media. This approach quickly yielded results within hours. A man contacted the police department saying he recognized the tattoo and that he believed the victim might be his relative. Teresa Ann Pullman. Police followed up on this lead and eventually confirmed the victim's identity. Teresa Ann Pullman was born in 1969 in the small town of Morton, Illinois. When she was 11, her parents divorced and she moved back to Texas with her mother. Teresa's childhood was chaotic, largely due to her mother's parenting style. At age 12, her mother took her to a bar and encouraged her to drink alcohol bought by strangers. They also smoked marijuana together, which illustrates the unhealthy environment Teresa was growing up in as a teenager. Teresa met a boy and ran away from home with him. Their journey across several states was dangerous, and the relationship ended quickly. Leaving Teresa alone in a strange city, she eventually returned to her mother, where she lived for a while, hoping for a better life during this time. She completed her education, worked as a waitress, and nurtured her dreams for the future. At age 25, Teresa became pregnant by a man her mother knew. They had a brief relationship, and on February 7, 1990, her daughter Christine Roosh was born. Teresa wanted to be a good mother, but life presented her with many challenges, despite her difficult temperament. She ignored the advice of a psychiatrist and refused to be hospitalized for treatment. Instead, she turned to self-medicating with various unknown drugs, none of which worked. Teresa eventually left her daughter Christine with her mother and moved to Illinois. Christine faced a difficult fate from an early age. She was sent to live with her grandmother, who struggled with alcoholism and did not provide a stable environment. Social services did not approve her grandmother as a guardian, resulting in Christine being placed with distant relatives. Fortunately, her foster family was devout and well-respected. Christine was fortunate to escape the darkness and instead enjoyed a happy, stable childhood in a loving home in a small town. During this time, Teresa completely stopped communicating with her daughter. In 2003, she met a man named Joel Ritchie, who helped stabilize her condition. As a result, she experienced fewer symptoms of bipolar disorder. The couple eventually had a son named Ryan. Joel took care of both Teresa and their child. However, the journey was not easy. Sometimes she would have breakdowns, fall into depression, become aggressive, sing, and even disappear for days. After such times, she would always call Joel to apologize. For a while, things would return to normal. These ups and downs continued for more than 5 years until the couple decided to separate in 2008. Unlike her previous experience with Christine, Teresa chose to raise her son on her own. In 2009, Teresa thought she was lucky to meet a new man named Nick. They began a whirlwind romance, and by the end of January, she had moved in with him. They initially lived with Nick's parents before buying their own house. Nick treated Teresa and her child Ryan well. They later got married. However, the old problems resurfaced. Nick expressed that Teresa would occasionally leave, causing him great distress each time. He lost patience when he stayed home with her son, Ryan. Just over a year after their marriage, they divorced. Time passed, but Teresa still thought about her daughter, Christine. She feared that Christine would never forgive her. However, Teresa still longed for the opportunity to reconnect and talk to her daughter. Christina grew up in Bloomington, Illinois, and knew very little about her birth mother or her past. She often wondered where her birth mother was and why she had been abandoned as a child, around the beginning of her sophomore year of high school. Her adoptive parents revealed to her the abuse she had suffered as a child. This shocking news devastated Christina and turned her life upside down. Negative thoughts flooded her mind, and she became withdrawn, often arguing with her adoptive parents. As her rebellion escalated, she turned to alcohol. Her grades plummeted, and her life went downhill. Although her parents tried their best to support and guide her, their efforts were not enough. At age 16, Christina dropped out of school, spending her time smoking, partying, and engaging in reckless behavior. Her relationship with her adoptive parents deteriorated. Culminating in an unplanned pregnancy, Christine discovered that her mother, Teresa, had faced the same difficult choice she was facing. Now Christine became curious and decided to search for her biological parents when she turned 18. She wanted to understand why Teresa had abandoned her and why she had not tried to reconnect over the years. However, it is unclear whether Christine found the answers she was looking for, as in the summer of 2017. Teresa was murdered in a forest preserve. Teresa's family did not report her missing because she had planned to travel to Bloomington to see Christine previously. Teresa began dating a new man named Lady Leo and even got a tattoo with his name. Her relationship with Leo progressed rapidly, and Teresa moved in with him. Her relatives expressed concern that she had not taken the time to get to know him, which led to problems after they lived together. It was clear that she was unhappy in the relationship a few months later. Teresa decided to end her relationship with Leo and moved to Bloomington, not only to see her daughter, but also to move out of Leo's house. After speaking with Teresa's relatives, the police discovered new details. On July 4, 2017, Teresa's family mentioned that she had argued with Leo over unpaid rent, which Teresa used as a reason to break up. The police then contacted Leo, who was eager to assist in the investigation, and quickly went to the sheriff's office. There, he informed the police that the fight the victim's family mentioned was just one of many unpleasant incidents in his relationship with Teresa during the months they lived together. She went missing for days on 5 different occasions. Leo said that most of their conflicts arose because of her struggles with alcohol and drug addiction. She was so immersed in her addiction that she didn't care about anything else. In addition, the police had a long conversation with Leo. They eventually concluded that he had nothing to do with her death. He himself was a victim of Teresa's instability and was relieved that she was finally out of his life. Despite the challenges in their relationship and the breakup, he was still emotional when he heard of her death. He cooperated fully with the police, allowing them to search his car and cell phone without any objection. They found nothing suspicious. In addition, Leo passed a lie detector test. He also provided the police with valuable information that helped them piece together the timeline of events. One important clue was about the hotel where Teresa was staying. The police arrived in Bloomington and first visited the hotel. They discovered her room and learned that it was the last place she was seen alive. The hotel staff were interviewed and confirmed that Teresa had been in that room for several days, but no one noticed anything unusual. Interestingly, a separate room was rented in the name of her daughter, Christine. This suggests that the meeting between Teresa and Christine had taken place. The police searched Teresa's room and found a large amount of evidence that she was a serious drug addict. The investigation focused on Teresa's daughter, Christine, who had been seen with her at the hotel, although Christine was the last known person to see Teresa alive. Christine had moved out at the time, and other guests were in the hotel room, making it impossible to find evidence there. Attempts to contact her resulted in only voicemail, and Christine was nowhere to be found. The police requested footage from the hotel's surveillance cameras and discovered some interesting footage. They found one from July 1, 2017, around 11:15 a.m., just before Teresa went missing. In this footage, Teresa is seen walking through the hotel hallways throughout the day wearing the same clothes. She and her daughter were seen coming and going several times, but nothing unusual was noted, however. Late in the evening, a man named Matt Isbell, approximately 25 years old, appeared with them on the night of July 2. Teresa, her daughter Christine, and Matt left the hotel together. But only Christine and Matt returned around 4 a.m. This raised significant suspicion. Christine and Matt were the last people known to have seen Teresa alive, making them important people to the police to gather more information. They needed to talk to Christine's daughter. Christine then contacted the police and scheduled a meeting for July 5 at the sheriff's office to discuss the case. Christine acted like a grieving daughter and blamed Leo, her mother's last boyfriend. Christine claimed that her mother, Teresa, had suffered greatly because of him. They had recently tried to reconcile, but their relationship was not smooth, and they argued constantly. When the police questioned Christine about Matt, she described him as an old friend she had just started dating. She mentioned that she had invited him to a hotel on July 1 to spend time with her mother. According to Christine, on the night of July 2, they took her mother to Hayward, 15 kilometers from where the body was found. Christine's account was unclear. She did not explain what her mother needed in the woods. That night, her mother simply said goodbye and left, and Christine never saw her again. Her story was vague and full of contradictions, largely repeating information that the police already knew. The police suspected that Christine was hiding something. The police decided to talk to Matt, hoping that he could confirm what Christine had said. However, their initial attempts to contact him were unsuccessful because the phone number Christine provided was incorrect. Police eventually contacted Matt and invited him to the station for questioning. At the police station, he explained that he and Christine lived nearby and had just started dating. He mentioned that they took her mother to Hayward, then dropped her off in the woods before returning home. Matt said he wasn't sure what happened to Teresa after that, but he suspected that someone attacked her in the woods. The police found the couple suspicious and believed that Christine knew more about Teresa's death. To gauge her reaction, the police devised a plan. They asked Christine to allow them to search her room. She quickly became nervous. She still insisted that she had nothing to do with her mother's murder. She asked for a lawyer and refused to speak to the police any further. Meanwhile, she did not know that Matt was providing information to the police. He changed his account of the events. He claimed that he had driven the mother and daughter to the reserve that night. He stayed in the car while the mother and daughter went into the woods a short time later. Only Christine returned to the parking lot. She explained that she had taken a different route and that a friend would pick up her mother later. They then left, and Matt had no idea what had happened in the woods. While this version of events seems more believable, it still feels like Matt is hiding something important. As the pressure mounts on him, he reveals that Christine killed her mother. This revelation shocks everyone in the room during the interrogation. Matt explains that on the night of July 1-2, the atmosphere was initially very relaxed. They all drank together and had a good time. Teresa then begins to share stories about her past struggles. It is revealed that Teresa used to be an escort. Christine confesses that she had also been involved in similar work. This causes Teresa to insist that her daughter stop her, which only angers Christine further. Despite her daughter's reaction, Teresa continues to make the situation worse. Teresa threatens her daughter, Christine, saying that if she does not stop her, Teresa will turn her in to the police. This terrified Christine, as she feared facing legal problems and possibly losing custody of her 2-year-old daughter, desperate and angry with her mother. Christine felt that killing her mother was the only way out of the situation. Matt then drove them to the reserve, and since Teresa was unfamiliar with the area, she trusted Christine when they reached the parking lot. Teresa was the first to get out of the car. Christine was next, and Christine suddenly attacked Teresa. Christine then strangled her mother until she passed out. Christine then dragged Teresa's body into the woods. Matt did not know what happened in the woods because he stayed in the parking lot, smoking and waiting for Christine to return. Matt then pointed out on a map where the crowbar had been discarded. The police were able to locate it based on this information. On July 7, 2017, the police obtained an arrest warrant for the couple. Matt also pointed out where Christine might have hidden the knife, but it was never found. After a thorough search of his car, they discovered traces of blood inside. Evidence gathered supported Matt's claim that he had nothing to do with Teresa's murder. A key piece of evidence against Christine was a text message she sent to Matt in which she expressed her intention to kill her mother. Meanwhile, DNA testing confirmed that cigarette butts found in the parking lot contained traces of Matt's DNA. As a result, both were arrested, and Matt's testimony became the basis for the charges against them. On the day of the preliminary hearing, something unexpected happened. Christine confessed to her guilt. This unexpected decision may have stemmed from her feelings of guilt over her mother's murder. Matt was charged as an accessory because he had the opportunity to intervene and prevent the murder, but chose not to. Matt knew about the impending attack on Teresa, but took them into the woods anyway. Matt Isbell, then 20 years old, received a 12-year prison sentence for his role as an accessory. On January 31, 2018, Christine Rausch was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years in prison. At the time, she was 23 years old. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Katie Passaniti. Loretta had no interest in her child, Katie. Loretta was just 15 years old when her daughter was born. Right after the birth, Loretta abandoned her daughter, and the father's identity was unknown. Consequently, Katie's grandmother took her in and cared for her. They formed a strong bond, and Katie always thought of her grandmother as her mother. When Katie turned 15, her biological mother, Loretta, re-entered her life. At that time, Loretta was 31 years old and had been living with a man named Ernest Later for almost 10 years, even taking his last name. Although they were never officially married, they referred to each other as spouses. Shortly after reuniting with her mother, Katie decided to move in with her and Ernest. However, the family reunion did not go as smoothly as hoped. Their life changed significantly when she moved in. As a teenager, she began to rebel. Her mother and Ernest had trouble communicating with her. She often ran away from home, attended parties, and only called parents by their first names. The family never developed a close relationship with her. The situation changed when Katie started college. She changed from a rebellious person to a more docile person. Being very intelligent, she was accepted into several prestigious institutions. She graduated with a degree in chemistry and earned a doctorate in applied mathematics from Johns Hopkins University. While still a student, she met a young man named Anthony Passati, who would later become her husband. Anthony recounted that she was the first person to approach him to ask for gum, which led to their acquaintance. Their friendship soon blossomed into a romantic relationship. A year later, Katie and Anthony got married, and 2 years after that, they had a daughter. At that time, she was 27 years old. The family eventually moved to San Antonio, Texas. Here, Anthony worked as a physician assistant, and he had good career prospects in the medical field. Katie taught chemistry and mathematics at several schools, earning a good salary. She had a stable career, but she decided to leave her job to become a mother again. Family was always important to her, so she decided to adopt a little girl. During this time, Katie tries to reconnect with her mother, Loretta. Even though they rarely communicated with each other before, but now they are both trying to get closer. Loretta began visiting Katie and grandchildren frequently. By then, Loretta was already retired. Loretta and Ernest lived on a 25-acre estate in a small town called Keithville. They built a log house and a large barn for agricultural equipment. Ernest manages a small farm, which was an excellent way to earn extra money during retirement. In 2008, a major change occurred. A local mining company exploited a large gas field on the farm. To obtain the extraction permit, Ernest was paid $400,000, and overnight, made him quite rich. He invested the money in his own business. Since he already had everything he wanted, he continued managing his small company as usual. Everything seemed normal, but a new problem arose. One day, Loretta called Katie and asked her a strange question. She couldn't remember how much sugar she needed for the cake. From that moment on, her calls became increasingly strange. It seems that with age, she began to have memory problems. The same happened to Ernest. One day he went with Loretta to their daughter's house, Katie, for Thanksgiving. But halfway there, he suddenly stopped. It seemed that he became disoriented and got lost. Then, he turned the car around and went back home. After these incidents, Katie sent Loretta and Ernest to the hospital for examination. The doctors diagnosed them with the onset of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Katie still keeps in regular contact with Loretta, calling her almost every day, as she was very worried during this time. To help with the housework, they hired Tina Van Moerkeek, who moved to the farm with her husband, Chris, and their child, living in a trailer. Tina became Loretta's personal assistant and driver, as Loretta had completely lost her ability to drive. Meanwhile, Chris helped with the housework for the Luttrell family and worked on the farm where Loretta and Ernest lived. Ernest and Loretta's health rapidly deteriorated. Their memory issues became more severe, so they need more maids to do housework. They were frequently busy dealing with various matters. Ernest became irritable, visibly losing his memory. His awareness became muddled, and he became more aggressive. He blamed the neighbor for all his troubles. Katie has talked about this many times. In April 2010, Ernest went to his house and accused his neighbors of trespassing on his property, leading to a scandal that got out of hand. Katie, who was visiting Loretta, called the police and reported that Ernest had threatened to kill his neighbor. Sheriff's deputies detained Ernest and took him to the nearest medical center, where he underwent a psychiatric evaluation and received treatment for a while. His condition was poor, and upon arrival at the medical center, he was confused and did not know why he was brought there. While Ernest was in the hospital, Katie decided to help her mother, Loretta, solve the problem. She went to the medical center and presented a power of attorney over Ernest's property, which he had supposedly signed earlier. Katie insisted that Ernest remain in a nursing home for Alzheimer's treatment, as his behavior was unpredictable and aggressive. She felt that he could be a danger to himself and to others. However, he denied having threatened his neighbor or having had a conflict. According to him, He did not understand why he was in a medical facility and demanded to be sent home. The situation was unclear. Had Ernest really signed the power of attorney and just forgotten, or is there another motive in this? However, Katie kept him in the hospital for observation for a week to determine what was wrong with him. Throughout this period, even without treatment, he remained completely clear-minded. Ultimately, Ernest was discharged from the hospital because there was no reason to keep him there any longer. Shortly before noon on July 25, 2010, Loretta called 911. She reported that her husband, Ernest, had passed away. At first, it seemed like a typical report of someone who had died of natural causes. However, there was a hint of unease in her voice. The emergency services dispatcher asked Loretta to try to give artificial respiration to Ernest. However, she replied that it would no longer help and asked the rescuers to come with the police as soon as possible. The sheriff's deputies arrived at the crime scene within minutes. Outside the house, they found Loretta. It was known that she suffered from Alzheimer's. She encountered the police and seemed more confused than upset. She obviously didn't know what to do. The officers entered the house to investigate and discovered the body of Ernest in a pool of blood. Doctors confirmed his death, caused by 5 gunshot wounds. According to Loretta, when she returned home from church, she found the body of her husband Ernest lying in a pool of blood. She did not know what had happened to him. Her statement was confirmed by other parishioners. Indeed, she had been at church. Reinforcements were called to the scene. When the forensic experts arrived, they immediately began examining the crime scene and collecting evidence. They noticed that some valuables were missing from the house, including Ernest's car. Near the place where the car had been stolen, they found unusual boot prints with a unique design. Tina, the housekeeper, and Chris lived on Ernest's farm. They claimed they were not at the house during the murder and provided a store receipt as proof of their whereabouts, which confirmed their alibi. Meanwhile, detectives reached out to Loretta's closest relatives. They later learned she had a daughter, Katie, who lived in San Antonio, Texas. Upon hearing the tragic news, Katie traveled to support her. Investigators are currently having difficulty clarifying the incident. What happened at the farm that day? At the scene, police confirmed that Ernest had died tragically. It certainly wasn't him who ended his life, as there was no weapon nearby. Someone had killed him, and the gun was hidden by the killer. Finding the gun became a priority for the investigation because it could offer important clues. Ernest was shot at point-blank range, including in the head, leaving no chance of survival. He was found lying in a pool of his own blood, and the gun cabinet next to the room had been opened and emptied the ammo. Additionally, Ernest's pickup truck and several valuable items were missing. The truck was easy to locate because it had distinctive features, including a homemade fuel tank. Ernest used this tank to refuel his agricultural equipment. It had a large capacity, designed to supply equipment for 2 days. Thanks to these unique features, the truck was quickly found. Eric Crane was well acquainted with the police officer because he abused illegal substances. He had a rich criminal history, mainly due to his addiction and drunk driving. All his life, Eric was in and out of prison for short periods of time. He was found just 2 days after the murder. He was immediately arrested in the car and taken to the police station for official questioning. However, he began to categorically deny his involvement in the incident. He claimed that he was at work at the time, but his alibi was not confirmed by his colleagues. Besides, he also could not explain how he ended up driving Ernest's pickup truck. His boots had a unique pattern on the sole, resembles shoe prints found at the crime scene. However, at first they could not get him to confess. Eric was kept in custody during the investigation because it seemed he was pretending and not telling the truth. On the day he was arrested, a local TV crew found out and went to the auto repair shop where he worked. They interviewed his manager and colleagues, who revealed that he was absent from work at the time of the murder. Surprisingly, while they were there, the shop manager received a call from Eric, who was calling from prison. Eric informed his employer that he was in trouble and couldn't come to work. He also asked his boss to lie to the police, saying he was at work at the time. His boss then asked if he had really killed Ernest. Then, he shared a shocking story. He admitted to pulling the trigger and shooting Ernest, but claimed he was persuaded to do so by Tina, an employee who was also Loretta's driver. It turned out that Tina and Eric were lovers, and she had asked him to help with the crime. He claims that Loretta is the one behind it all. Eric claimed that Loretta lied and went to church during the crime to create a false alibi. She waited there until Ernest was killed. Afterward, Eric called Tina from prison to discuss details of the crime. A few hours later, a recording of this conversation reached the police station. Investigators needed to verify if Eric was truthful, if Tina and Loretta were involved in the murder. On July 28, Tina was brought in as a suspect. She denied any involvement and claimed ignorance of the incident, but her motives remained very suspicious. Ernest had always been very kind to Tina's, providing housing for her family and giving her a job with a stable income. In her situation, it would be wise to maintain this relationship for as long as possible. Why would she kill her benefactor? It seemed illogical. However, detectives suspected she was lying. To confirm, they searched her belongings and found a bank card belonging to Ernest in her purse. Checking the database, the police discovered that months before the murder, Ernest and Loretta had filed a complaint against Tina for stealing money. Eventually, they decided to forgive her without prosecution. Tina confesses that she continues to steal Ernest's money. Her husband, Chris, revealed that the night before the crime, she did not stay at home because they had a fight and she went to a hotel. It turned out that Tina had spent the night there with Eric, planning the attack on Ernest. After several hours of interrogation, she confessed that Eric murdered Ernest, but she claimed that Loretta was the mastermind. Loretta had approached Tina, saying that Ernest should die. Initially, she refused, but Loretta coerced her into participating. The motive for the crime was financial. Shortly before his death, Ernest had promised to pay off his granddaughter's tuition debts, i.e. Katie's daughter. The granddaughter was at risk of being expelled over a $50 shortfall, and Katie was struggling financially. However, when it came time to fulfill his promise, Ernest refused to pay the $50. Loretta was so angry that he was so stingy that she thought he deserved to die. Afterwards, Loretta asked Tina and Eric for help, promising to pay $11,000. The crime was meant to look like a robbery, so Loretta allowed Eric to take Ernest's gun and personal belongings. Consequently, the gun and several valuables were missing from the house. Eric stole the murder weapon from their home and then disposed of it. Of course, Tina and Eric's testimony was not enough to arrest Loretta. Before arresting Loretta, Tina was asked to call her. Her task was to talk to Loretta and try to get Loretta's to confess. She agreed because she wanted to make a deal with the prosecution to reduce her sentence. She also needed to testify against Eric and Loretta. Then, she phoned Loretta, the police recorded and listened to the call. According to the plan, she said that Eric would be released on bail in an hour. So, she needed $1,000 to cover his bail costs. Loretta agreed to pay and asked for more time to get the money. This provides evidence of Loretta's relationship with Tina and Eric, but could not obtain a confession to the murder. Ernest's funeral was held on July 29th. After the ceremony, Loretta was arrested as she left the cemetery. She was accused of hiring Eric to kill her husband, Ernest, and taken to the police station for questioning. Despite the accusations, she denied any involvement. The police pressured her, claiming she attended church that day, knowing Ernest would be killed. They alleged that she had orchestrated the crime. However, she remained firm, stating she attends church every Sunday. She also acted confused, repeatedly asking what she was guilty of. There is no concrete evidence against her, other than a phone call. It doesn't prove much. Loretta repeatedly claimed that she was always in church during the time of the crime. She mentioned her Alzheimer's disease and called the idea of her killing her husband absurd. She suggested that Tina, who had previously stolen money, may be involved in Ernest's murder. However, she denied any involvement herself. Her daughter, Katie, supported her claims and often shared this perspective with journalists. Even Ernest's family believed Loretta was not involved, pointing to her harmonious relationship with Ernest over the years. However, they later informed the police that they suspected Katie and insisted Katie should be more thoroughly investigated. It seems money is the motive. Ernest's farm was valued at around $1.5 million. Upon his death, the farm would pass to Loretta, and after her death, it will be passed on to Katie. Therefore, Katie focuses more on Ernest's assets. Because of this, Ernest's relatives decided to take the case to court. Nonetheless, Katie had a copy of Ernest's will, which allocated the property to Katie and her daughters, leaving the entire Ernest's family out of the inheritance. However, the dates in the will have many suspicious points. It was signed just 3 weeks before Ernest's death. His relatives believed it was either forged or that he was coerced into signing it while unaware of his actions. Consequently, they decided to contest the will in August 2010. By then, the investigation into Ernest's murder was nearly complete. There were 3 suspects: Loretta, believed to be the mastermind, Tina, an accomplice, and Eric, the executor of the plan. However, detectives suspected a 4th person might be involved. This was Katie, who had the strongest motive and stood to gain the most from the tragedy. Ernest's family insists that he will not pass on his inheritance to Loretta's stepdaughter, Katie. Ernest's family is certain that he wouldn't leave his inheritance to Loretta's stepdaughter, Katie. Ernest was known for being very frugal, even stingy. He wouldn't spend money carelessly or leave his family without an inheritance. Besides, he never had a close relationship with Katie, so there was no way he would leave everything to her. While the prosecution was preparing to try Loretta, Tina, and Eric, Ernest's family filed a lawsuit claiming inheritance rights. By then, the battle over the inheritance had been ongoing for several months. As police looked into the details of the incident, they began to suspect foul play. The main goal is to prove that Katie's copy of the inheritance will is a forgery. The copy of the will bears the highly suspicious signature of a notary named Penny Penner. On October 19th, the police came to see Penny, the notary. She initially claimed that she had signed the documents on July 1st, nearly a month before Ernest's death. She stated that she signed them at home, in the presence of several witnesses, including Loretta. However, she later confessed that the will was indeed forged, as she signed it after Ernest's death. When pressured, she revealed that Katie had come to her after Ernest was murdered. According to Penny, Katie explained that Ernest had died suddenly without having time to properly draft the will and that he had no living relatives to claim the inheritance. Katie was concerned that her mother, Loretta, who suffers from Alzheimer's disease, will have difficulty registering property, resulting in the property belonging to the state. The notary Penny feeling sympathy for Katie. She did not investigate the true circumstances and decided to help her. However, facing criminal charges, she chose to disclose the truth to the investigators. To avoid legal issues, she agreed to assist the detective by making several phone calls to Katie. Her task was to get Katie to confess to forging the documents. Following the plan, she called Katie, claiming she had problems with the police and needed details of the incident to draft a new document to distract the investigation. Katie answered several questions, which led to her conviction for involvement in the forgery of the will. The police had enough evidence to search Katie's house in San Antonio. They came to search for documents related to her forging of the will. When the officers entered, Katie reached for her purse. Fearing she might have a weapon, they handcuffed her. However, the purse contained no gun, only a letter with instructions for creating a fake, which she intended to destroy. In the house, they discovered boxes of documents, including copies of power of attorney for the house and notes regarding Ernest's health. It appeared she had been monitoring him for a long time, possibly waiting for the right moment to act. The police hoped to find evidence that she was involved in Ernest's murder, but they found nothing. Investigators suspected she had planned the murder with Loretta, but lacked direct evidence. Ultimately, they had to release Katie and remove her handcuffs. However, they did not give up. Instead, they decided to change their approach. After visiting Katie's house, the investigators decided to change their approach. Meanwhile, Loretta had been in jail for a long time without bail. Her Alzheimer's disease was worsening, and she was declared incompetent to stand trial due to her health. Consequently, she was sent to a psychiatric hospital for criminals indefinitely. During this time, she confessed, but her confession was not considered significant because of her condition. At the trial, the prosecution doubted that Loretta could have planned the crime alone. It seemed clear that she had assistance, probably from her daughter, Katie. After that, investigators focused on Eric Crane. In June 2011, he pleaded guilty to the crime in exchange for life sentences without the possibility of parole, thus avoiding the death penalty. As part of the deal, Eric was required to testify against everyone involved in the crime. Then, the detectives pressured Tina by threatening that they would find a way to get her the death penalty. This pressure was enough to make her confess. She pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against the other conspirators. Her interrogation was recorded on video, exposing criminal activities. Tina revealed that Loretta planned the crime and convinced her to kill Ernest. Katie was also aware of the plan and conspired with Loretta. In return, Loretta promised Tina that she and her family could live in Ernest's house indefinitely. More than a year had passed since Ernest's murder, and finally, the investigation had gathered all the necessary evidence. On March 2, 2012, the police returned to San Antonio and went to Katie's house. They forced their way in, breaking down the door. Katie's husband watched as she was handcuffed and taken away. On April 25, 2013, Katie appeared in court. She accused of committing murder in July 2010. She faced the possibility of life imprisonment without parole. The prosecution argued that her sole motive was to take over Ernest's farm. At first, she intended to put him in a nursing home to take over the house. She planned to fabricate a story about a scandal with the neighbors, then trick him into signing the power of attorney. When this plan failed, she allegedly turned to a more violent alternative. By this time, Loretta's Alzheimer's disease had progressed, but Ernest remained in good health. Katie had always had a poor relationship with him, and it was clear that he would deny her an inheritance if her mother, Loretta, died first. This gave her a motive to eliminate him, with one theory suggesting the murder was staged to look like a failed robbery. At trial, Tina claimed that she was forced to participate in the case without any other choice. She stated that Katie pressured and threatened her, trying to persuade her by promising payment. However, Tina's testimony was not convincing to the prosecutor's office. The prosecution's other key witness was Eric. Contrary to expectations, Eric testified that discussions about the murder plan only involved Tina. He claimed he never discussed it with Katie or Loretta, but suspected Loretta's involvement. Later, he added that if Katie had been involved, he would have known, but he was hearing about her involvement for the first time. The defense presented arguments to prove Katie's innocence by focusing on document forgery. According to the lawyer, Katie had indeed used a notary's services to prevent her mother from receiving an inheritance, but this has nothing to do with the murder. Loretta did not attend the hearings due to health issues. The prosecution played a recording of Loretta's testimony where she admitted involvement in the murder, but she didn't mention anything about Katie. On May 14, 2013, after just an hour and a half of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Katie Passaniti was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and forging multiple documents. She received a life sentence without parole. As they left the courtroom, Ernest's family thanked each juror for their decision. They succeeded in contesting the will and inherited Ernest's entire estate. Despite this, Katie continued to assert her innocence, visibly shocked and fearful after the verdict. Tina, who cooperated with the prosecution, avoided the death penalty but was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Loretta continued her treatment until her death and never appeared in court. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of MacDonald family. Jeffrey MacDonald was born on October 12, 1943, in New York, USA. He was a well-known figure in his youth, serving as the quarterback for his high school football team and being very popular among his peers. After graduating from Princeton, Jeffrey attended medical school and completed an internship at a prestigious medical center in New York. He married Colette Stevenson, a high school acquaintance. Shortly after their wedding, they welcomed their daughter Kimberly, and 3 years later, their son Kristen was born. After completing his education, Jeffrey joined the Army and was later accepted into the elite Green Berets. In the next 2 years, Jeffrey was assigned to the Fort Bragg military base in North Carolina. After a period of frequent relocations, their life finally became stable. They settled in the nearby city of Fayetteville and lived in a house provided by the state. Jeffrey returned home from work at 6 p.m. and no longer had to go on business trips, which allowed Colette to feel more at ease. She hoped that once Jeffrey completed his service in a few years, they could move to their own farmhouse, away from the city's hustle and bustle. At the time of the tragedy, Colette was pregnant with their third child, and everything seemed perfect. Their love story tragically turned into one of the most horrific crime episodes in U.S. history. At approximately 3:30 a.m. on February 17, 1970, the operator of the Fayetteville Rescue Service received a call from a man identifying himself as Captain Jeffrey MacDonald. He reported that a violent attack had taken place in his home, stating that his wife had been stabbed to death and possibly raped. He was unclear about the fate of his children and urged for immediate assistance. The dispatcher quickly dispatched a police car to the scene. As the police were heading to the house, they saw a strange woman standing in the rain at 3:55 a.m. wearing a wide-brimmed hat. She was doing nothing and appeared to be waiting for something. However, the officers didn't have time to investigate further, so they drove past her. A few minutes later, they arrived at the Jeffrey family home, where the police entered through the back door because the lights inside were off. In the first room, officers discovered the body of a woman lying on the floor, showing no signs of life. She was covered in blood, and her position suggested she may have been raped. Her face was severely disfigured. She lay on her back next to her injured husband. As the first officer approached, Jeffrey urgently inquired about the fate of his children, whom he had heard screaming but could not get to. Another police officer searched the other rooms and found a brutal scene in the children's bedroom, where they discovered the mutilated head of 5-year-old Kimberly, with her neck and upper body also bearing multiple stab wounds. In another room, 2-year-old Kristen lay on the bed, suffering from multiple injuries to his back and chest. Jeffrey was in serious condition, having been stabbed in the head and upper chest. At one point, he lost consciousness, but a police officer was able to revive him to gather information about the incident. Jeffrey reported that 3 men and 1 woman had broken into the house. He suspected they were hippies, noting that one of the men was dark-skinned and wore a jacket with a sergeant's insignia. He also described a suspicious woman in a hat whom the police had encountered earlier, but unfortunately, it was too late to find her that night. Jeffrey was the only survivor of the attack that night, while the others sadly did not make it. He received first aid to treat his wounds, including a serious lung injury, and was given a sedative. Once stabilized, police spoke with him about the incident. He recounted that he and his wife had shared a glass of orange juice mixed with alcohol that evening. Since their daughter was sleeping, he decided to sleep on the couch in the living room. Jeffrey falls asleep in front of the TV but suddenly wakes up to intense pain. He is being attacked by 3 unidentified assailants. A woman in a hat stands to one side, holding a flashlight or candle, watching the attack. Jeffrey thinks the attackers look like hippies on drugs. The woman gives orders to the men. Chaos then erupts, and Jeffrey loses consciousness. When he regains consciousness, he finds his wife unresponsive. He tries to give her first aid, but to no avail. Desperate to get to his children, he finds himself unable to move due to his injuries, so he calls 911. The Army Criminal Investigation Department sent the most inexperienced police staff to the scene. After examining the area, he concluded that Jeffrey's story was not true. The officer found the story of Jeffrey, with the hippies, unlikely. He found no evidence that others were present. After this decision, the investigation shifted its focus to proving Jeffrey's guilt. The head of the MacDonald family was arrested and Jeffrey was charged with 3 counts of criminal conspiracy. The case quickly turned into a disaster. From the outset, Jeffrey's defense attorneys aimed to assess the professionalism of the police during the search of the house. Through cross-examination, it was discovered that numerous violations had occurred. The procedures used had compromised the integrity of the evidence and the crime scene. The area had been essentially trampled, making it extremely difficult to identify any traces left by the criminals. This situation allowed the defense to argue that the prosecution's conclusion about Jeffrey's involvement in the crimes was incorrect, and that the killers were strangers, hippies. Jeffrey was a devoted family man, a caring father and husband, and a respected professional. As a result, he had many supporters, including colleagues who believed in his innocence. They felt there was no motive for the murder and found it hard to believe he would harm himself just to fake a near-death experience. His grandfather, Freddie Cassap, was so upset that he started a nationwide campaign to prove Jeffrey's innocence. Meanwhile, an article criticized the military justice system for holding closed hearings that excluded the public and the media. The situation did not improve. The trial remained hidden from public view, with more evidence later presented to the Supreme Court highlighting police incompetence. The investigation was sloppy. The ambulance driver tampered with evidence at the scene and even stole Jeffrey's wallet while police were present. An Army doctor compromised crucial evidence, including hair samples needed for comparison. Fingerprints were mixed up with various items such as a phone and a baby bottle. Most of the people involved in the investigation were inexperienced and unprofessional. The number of violations identified continued to grow with each minute of questioning. The investigation received an unexpected tip about a young woman seen on the street in the rain, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. Her name was Helena Stokely. Helena was the daughter of a retired Army officer and had a troubled connection with the criminal world. While she was a police informant, she was also deeply involved in the hippie culture and had been selling illegal substances for many years. The police interviewed Helena and obtained valuable information about her associates. However, serious mistakes occurred during the interrogation. Notably, the police failed to record the conversation, which was necessary for presenting evidence in court. The inexperienced police claimed that the investigation into Helena's involvement was still ongoing. However, the situation worsened so much that the police simply did not know where she was. She fled when everyone realized the full scale of the incompetence that was committed during the Army investigation. The investigation must start all over again on all issues. Despite this, the military leadership still kept the hearing closed to the media. Meanwhile, one police officer chose to share information with journalists about the mistakes made by the Army Commission of the Armed Forces. This angered the military leadership even more. While everyone else believed he was innocent, the military commission refused to acknowledge their own incompetence. Unfortunately, they held significant power and were unwilling to back down. They asserted that, although there was no clear motive for the crime, Jeffrey might have used substances that could provoke aggression and potentially lead to murder. Contrary to the prosecution's allegations, witnesses began to testify that Jeffrey was a loving husband and father. The defense presented a large body of evidence in support of this view. Furthermore, at the time of the massacre, Jeffrey was in a stable mental state. Only a small amount of alcohol was found in his system, which would not have significantly impaired his judgment or led him to commit such violent acts. Along with friends and family who testified, qualified experts, including a psychiatrist, evaluated Jeffrey and concluded that he was sane and had no homicidal tendencies toward his family. Even the civil police believed that Jeffrey was innocent due to the lack of evidence against him. His mother had to sell their house to afford legal fees. Ultimately, he was cleared of charges due to insufficient evidence. However, this did not stop the Army Commission from reopening the investigation later on. The military police promised to persist in their efforts to convict Captain Jeffrey MacDonald, regardless of the previous investigation's flaws. They believed that their earlier mistakes did not rule out the possibility of Jeffrey's guilt. The situation was not serious and did not significantly affect the outcome. Jeffrey resigned from the U.S. Army. Disillusioned with the military, he began a campaign to expose the armed forces through the media. However, he was unaware of the powerful enemies he was facing and the dangers that would be placed upon him. Meanwhile, the police found Helena Stokely. She claimed to have witnessed the murder of the MacDonald family, allegedly committed by her friends. Helena was willing to testify in court, hoping to be granted immunity from prosecution. Her testimony was verified through a lie detector test. Despite this, the military leadership refused to consider any other suspects, focusing solely on Jeffrey and preparing to charge him again. In the summer of 1971, Jeffrey and a friend moved to Long Beach, California, in search of a fresh start. Initially not realizing that a conspiracy was brewing against him, they both found jobs in the emergency department of a medical center, where their efforts helped make it the best department in the entire facility. Jeffrey's skills were highly regarded, leading to his work being published in medical journals. He also became an advocate for children's rights, fighting against child abuse. The military prosecutor's office continued to reopen the case, and on the grounds that they had obtained Jeffrey's psychiatric reports, he was charged again. The trial was scheduled for mid-1979 and a smear campaign began. It was a high-profile case, and from the start, the armed forces were formed to fight Jeffrey's. And at that time, people from the highest echelons of power rallied against Jeffrey, a former Army captain. Assistant U.S. Attorney James Blackburn wanted to use the case as a springboard for his career. He was later convicted of forgery, fraud, and embezzlement. But at the time of the triple murder retrial, Jeffrey's reputation was impeccable. The assistant prosecutor had concealed evidence that proved Jeffrey's innocence. And the Attorney General was not even allowed to conduct his own independent examination of the evidence collected or review the case file. It was clear that the judge was biased toward the prosecution, which affected the outcome of the trial. Any evidence that could have proven that Jeffrey innocent was not presented to the jury or provided to Jeffrey's attorney. For example, the victim was found holding 5 strands of light-colored hair. The prosecution claimed that these hairs came from a doll owned by the victim's daughter. However, they actually belonged to Helena Stokely, who was wearing a light-colored wig that she removed shortly after the murder. Additionally, a hair belonging to Jeffrey was found in the victim's hand, but since he lived there, this was not unusual and could have been a coincidence. This evidence did not prove Jeffrey's guilt. The skin particles found under Kimberly and Kristen's fingernails were not their father's and were identified as belonging to the attackers. However, the particles were never analyzed and eventually disappeared. This evidence, along with much else that could have proven Jeffrey's innocence, was deliberately ignored at trial. A key part of the prosecution's case was the pajama fibers found on the chisel believed to have been used to kill Jeffrey's children. The prosecution claimed the chisel was the weapon used and contained particles from the clothing Jeffrey was wearing when police found him on the night of the triple murder. Years later, it was discovered that these claims were false. Police found several black fibers on the chisel that matched those found on the bodies of Kristen and Kimberly. However, these fibers did not match any of the clothing from the MacDonald's home. Additionally, wax droplets were found at the crime scene that did not match any of the candles from the victims' homes. These wax droplets were actually used by Helena Stokely in her rituals. Helena claimed to be a witch and practiced magic, which became a key factor in the case. The prosecution made a strong claim that fibers from Jeffrey's pajamas were found in Colette's hair. However, this claim was later proven to be false. The defense attorney, Jeffrey, was unable to object to this assertion at the hearing because it had never been mentioned before. There were also other false pieces of evidence, including claims of bloody marks on the couple's bed sheets, which the prosecution argued indicated that the husband had dragged his wife's body. It was later revealed that these bloody marks did not exist. Furthermore, the prosecution was unaware of important information at the hearing. Specifically, the prosecution was unaware that Helena Stokely had contacted the FBI in 1978, claiming that she was involved in a triple homicide while she was being treated for depression and had attempted to end her life in the hospital. During the trial, Helena said that on the day of the massacre, she was with her boyfriend Greg Mitchell and some soldiers from Fort Braga. They were all using drugs, and according to her, they lost control. Helena mentioned that she called the MacDonald family's house late at night to check if everyone was home, but she couldn't remember what happened afterward. The military police then approached her, and she felt so intimidated that during the second trial, she was unable to recount events between midnight and 5 a.m. However, she did acknowledge having a hat and a light wig, which were later destroyed because they could potentially serve as evidence against her. At trial, Helena claimed she had been present at the massacre, holding a candle and muttering strange incantations. However, she maintained that she had not harmed any of the MacDonald family. She felt sick when her friends were near the children, prompting her to flee the house. It is thought that the murders were not random. Helena's friends may have been motivated by revenge. The soldiers were angry that Dr. Jeffrey had refused to give them illegal substances. Helena passed a polygraph test 3 times, and her statements were validated. Despite this, her testimony was deemed unreliable. The judge imposed restrictions on providing information about Helena and her soldier friends, which became one of the obstacles for Jeffrey's defense. The defense relied on the psychological profile and personal qualities of the accused to convince the jury of his inability to commit murder. The judge allowed the use of previously collected data, but only if Jeffrey underwent another examination by a psychiatrist. This request was of course a trap, as the psychiatrist had been cooperating with the military for 8 years while the investigation was ongoing. The prosecutor's office, eager to put Jeffrey behind bars for good, asked the doctor to make a finding. After a brief interrogation, the doctor declared Jeffrey a psychopathic murderer. Ultimately, the court refused to allow the use of Jeffrey's previous psychiatric records, which had been obtained from another psychiatrist. Instead, the jury was presented with the new psychiatrist's report, which had a devastating effect on the defense. The prosecution replaced Jeffrey's rosy image with that of a true monster. The jury found Jeffrey MacDonald guilty of murdering his wife, Colette, and their 2 children, Kimberly and Kristen. Sentenced him to 3 life terms. Even with this, the revenge of the military police leadership was not over. After learning that Fort Braga soldiers had a serious problem with illegal substances, the unit's leadership was unprepared for such problems, which coincided with the emergence of the burgeoning hippie movement. Under Jeffrey, the situation became more difficult for the soldiers to access, which made them unhappy. Later, some gathered to go to Jeffrey's house to take revenge. Helena's guilt was unquestionable. Even her husband, whom she married in the 80s, believed she was involved. He thought she hadn't committed murder but was likely a witnessed the incident. Helena shared many details about the crime scene that had never been made public at the time. The girl was present in MacDonald's house on that fateful night, and this is well established. She underwent 3 polygraph tests, all supporting her account of being there. Her testimony was also recorded on video. According to her, when they entered the house, they forced Jeffrey to write a prescription for Zach, which led to a fight that resulted in the murder of Jeffrey's family members. Jeffrey was left alive, turned into a martyr. The criminals wrote death to all pigs on the wall, likely trying to imitate Charles Manson, who was widely known at that time. Helena passed away at the age of 30 due to complications from liver disease. This incident occurred in 1970, and Helena's testimony was recorded with the judge's approval. At the time of the triple murder, her boyfriend, Greg Michel, was a soldier struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder after returning from Vietnam. As a result, he started using drugs heavily and had to enter treatment once more due to his addiction. He later admitted to a friend that he was involved in the MacDonald family's murder. At the crime scene, several pieces of evidence were collected, including Greg's blood and hair samples. It was noted that he was left-handed, and an independent expert determined that the knife wounds were likely made with the left hand. Additionally, he had liver issues, which prevented him from testifying during the trial. Jeffrey MacDonald's fatal mistake was befriending writer Joe McGinnis. They met just before his retrial, and Jeffrey asked Joe to write a book about his case. Jeffrey believed this would give him an advantage in the upcoming hearings. Jeffrey then allowed Joe to attend all of the meetings in detail. In return, Jeffrey received a portion of the book's advance from the publisher and agreed not to contest the book's contents. The friendship between the 2 men grew stronger. Joe supported Jeffrey and convinced him that Joe was still defending Jeffrey's innocence. However, Joe eventually betrayed Jeffrey by portraying him as the true monster in his book. From private conversations, Joe discovered that just before the triple murder, Jeffrey had taken diet pills, which were quite strong at that time. Although this was an isolated incident, Joe exaggerated the situation, suggesting that Jeffrey was taking 3 pills daily, which could have led to a serious overdose. Joe claimed this was the cause of Jeffrey's anger and violent behavior towards his family. He even pointed to a specific incident. Jeffrey's daughter had wet his side of the bed. In a normal family, the father would not react angrily to such an incident, but Joe saw it as the reason why Jeffrey, the man who was supposed to love his family, lost control. Joe believed that, under the influence of drugs, he had gone psychotic and ended up killing an entire family. However, a toxicology test found no drugs in Jeffrey's system, only a small amount of alcohol. During the trial, Joe said he had changed his mind about Jeffrey's guilt, believing it was more financially beneficial to Jeffrey. The controversial book did significant damage to Jeffrey's reputation. As a result, support for Jeffrey's innocence dwindled. However, Jeffrey successfully sued the book's author for libel. In August 1980, Jeffrey filed a lawsuit seeking millions in damages. After several hearings, the court awarded him $325,000. While most of the compensation was placed in a trust, Jeffrey retained the right to continue his fight for justice against the author. Jeffrey's story resonated with many people. Several well-known lawyers believed in his innocence and volunteered their services to help secure his acquittal. Despite their efforts, numerous appeals were rejected in 1989. However, during the trial and the review of the court's decision, new evidence emerged that supported Jeffrey's claim of non-involvement in the triple murder, including results from examinations. Unfortunately, the same judge presided over the proceedings. This judge continued to hinder the defense team, demonstrating a lack of impartiality throughout the case. A significant breakthrough during this time was the advent of new DNA testing technologies that allowed Jeffrey's defense team to conduct their own analyses. Sadly, at this stage, the judge repeatedly obstructed the lawyers' efforts to seek justice. Information about Helena Stokely finally emerged. A video of her testimony was made available to the lawyers. By this point, Jeffrey, the wrongfully convicted man, had spent 20 years in prison but had never stopped fighting for his freedom. Meanwhile, the military prosecutor's office continued to resist, attempting to dispute all the new evidence. Additional witnesses were found, some of whom had been intimidated and coerced into supporting the prosecution. Stokely, the MacDonald family's nanny, admitted to the prosecution that she had been at the MacDonald's home during the murders. She also revealed that the prosecution had threatened to prosecute her if she testified in court, which discouraged her from speaking out. Prosecutor Blackburn was eventually convicted of several charges, including forgery, theft, and embezzlement, and was remanded in custody in January 2006. New evidence came to light, suggesting a possible retrial. First, a videotaped confession by Helena Stokely was made public, followed by the release of evidence supporting Stokely's claim. DNA testing showed that hair and tissue found on the victim did not match anyone known and belonged to a stranger. In March 2006, a man came forward to the police, claiming that he had been drinking regularly at a bar with a man who had confessed to the MacDonald murders. This man turned out to be Lena's boyfriend, Greg Mitchell. The last time he had heard details of the case was a few weeks before Greg's death. The cashier at the store near the house, Jeffrey, claimed that he saw a group of hippies enter the store the morning after the murders. They looked unkempt, were covered in blood, and were talking to each other about the crime they had committed. However, they then threatened him with his life. The cashier recognized Greg and Helena among this group. An employee at the rehabilitation center where Greg Mitchell was treated also claimed that he had repeatedly confessed to her that he had killed the Jeffrey MacDonald's wife and children, even writing his initials on the wall of the center. Unfortunately, all of this evidence was ignored by the court. 54 years have passed since the tragic murder of the MacDonald family. Defenders at the Supreme Court are still trying to prove Jeffrey's innocence by filing appeals. His most recent appeal against his conviction was in 2021, but was dismissed. Jeffrey remains in prison but still holds out hope that he will one day be free again. While in prison, he met Catherine, an activist involved in the Innocence movement, and they developed a relationship. She visited him regularly and eventually married. Catherine runs a website dedicated to Jeffrey's case, working to secure his release. The 80-year-old, who has spent most of his life in prison, argues that those who actually committed the crime are still walking free. Many of those responsible have lived their entire lives without facing justice, and some have even died without being held accountable for their actions. Hello, crime enthusiasts, are you ready for another chilling investigation? The case of Jaime Han. Jaime Han was born on October 25, 1983, in Orangeburg, South Carolina. She was a compassionate person who always put the needs of others first. She was known for her kindness and her ability to make people happy. Despite her parents' divorce and remarriage, but she grew up with her two brothers, Brett and Justin, and sister Ashley, and she maintaining a cheerful outlook. Jaime attended an elite private prep school known for its academic excellence. Her friends and family saw her as a talented and enthusiastic person with a promising future in politics. During a school trip to the University of North Carolina in junior high, Jaime became enamored with the campus and aspired to attend the institution. As she grew older, she joined the board of the Center of Hope, which supported troubled teenagers. She also became involved in various political campaigns, including Senator John Edwards' 2008 presidential campaign. Jaime emerged as a prominent figure within the North Carolina Democratic Party. During this campaign, she met Nation, and the two developed a strong relationship. Over time, their relationship evolved from a platonic connection to a loved one. After just 4 months of dating, the couple got engaged and eventually married on April 18, 2009. Both Jaime and Nation were successful in their careers, with Jaime running her own consulting firm, focused on political fundraising, and Nation working as a well-known online strategist for politicians and nonprofits. People who knew them described them as exceptionally kind, tender, and generous. They have been actively involved in a project protecting young families in North Carolina. Although they didn't have children yet, they plan to start a family soon. Jonathan Broyhill, 31 years old, a close friend of Nation who had been staying in the couple's home as a guest. Jaime was also familiar with Jonathan, having hired him as an accountant at her political consulting firm after he moved to North Carolina. Nation and Jaime kindly him a place to stay in their home until he could find his own accommodation. Jonathan and Nation were from the same hometown, and their friendship began in 2000 during a church trip. Although they had a 4-year age difference, they quickly formed a close bond. Like many childhood friendships, they lost touch when one of them went to college, but reconnected after graduation and became very close. In fact, Jonathan was the best man at Nation and Jaime's wedding in April 2009. The trio of Jonathan, Jaime, and Nation was incredibly close-knit. This strong bond was built on unity, with the three sharing countless moments together. They go on vacation together, have dinner together every Monday, and enjoy holidays together. However, this was a difficult time for Jonathan, who had recently been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Jaime and Nation were deeply concerned about Jonathan's well-being and had been supporting him throughout his medical journey. Jaime was overcome with emotion one day and asked Nation if they should have a child soon. They wanted their future child to have the chance to know their dear friend Jonathan. The reason behind this sudden desire was Jonathan's recent cancer diagnosis. However, Jonathan's health struggles weren't new. Over the years, he had been in and out of hospitals multiple times. At one point, he had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis during a gallbladder operation. Given his fragile health, Jaime and Nation invited Jonathan to live with them temporarily. They offered him care and support until he could recover. Jonathan spent so much time at Nation family home that some of their neighbors thought of him as a part of the family. Their deep and close relationship makes the violent incident in which all three were stabbed in their own home all the more puzzling and tragic. On a fateful Monday, Jonathan was already at the house, discussing work-related matters with Jaime in the kitchen. Nation had just arrived home and was heading upstairs to change when they were startled by Jaime's screams. Assuming the worst due to Jonathan's health issues, Nation rushed downstairs, where they met Jaime's frantic voice, crying out for help. A frantic scene unfolded as Nation rushed into the kitchen, where he found his wife severely injured and bleeding on the floor, while Jonathan stood over her, menacingly wielding a large kitchen knife. The sight was too shocking for Nation to comprehend. Jonathan, with the knife raised, advanced toward Nation. Then, Nation with one hand, Nation grabbed the knife's blade and, with the other, struck Jonathan in the face. At the same time, Nation urgently told Jaime to run for safety as he tried to subdue Jonathan. She managed to get up from the floor despite her serious injuries and ran through the side door to find help. Once Jaime was out of the house, Nation overcame his shock, pushed Jonathan aside, and followed his wife. Outside, Jaime struggled to reach the nearest neighbor's house but found no one home despite her knocking. While trying to reach the next house, exhausted and weakened by her injuries, Jaime collapsed unconscious in the neighbor's yard. Fortunately, passers-by heard the commotion and came to her aid, and a neighbor who was alerted by Jaime's screams called for an ambulance and the police. Nation frantically searched for Jaime after realizing she was gone. Following a bloody trail, he found her in a neighbor's yard, clutching her side in agony but still conscious. Kneeling beside her, Nation held her hand and tried to reassure her, making promises about their future together, including children, vacations, and future anniversaries. Overwhelmed by the thought of losing her, Nation fought back tears as he spoke. As they waited for help to arrive, a neighbor rushed over with a towel to apply pressure to Jaime's bleeding abdomen. The towel quickly became soaked in blood. Another neighbor tried to make Jaime more comfortable by propping her legs up on a bag of leaves. The wait for an ambulance felt like an eternity to the onlookers. As minutes passed, Jaime's breathing became labored, a clear sign of her critical condition. The ambulance team arrived and immediately performed first aid to save Jaime's life. Nation, who had suffered serious cuts on his hand during the struggle, also needed immediate medical attention. Both Nation and Jaime were rushed to the hospital. Upon arrival, she was immediately wheeled in for emergency surgery. Nation stitched up his own wound, but his mind was preoccupied with fear for his wife's condition. In shock, he tried multiple times to visit her in the ICU but was denied access. Sitting on a hospital bed, he anxiously waiting for information on Jaime's condition. He also was aware of the severity of her injuries, numerous stab wounds, a severed artery, and extensive liver damage. All he could do was hope and pray that she would pull through. Against all odds, Jaime survived the surgery, but unfortunately, this brief moment of hope was short-lived. She never regained consciousness and passed away 2 days later. She succumbing to the injuries she sustained. The autopsy revealed that Jaime had suffered 24 stab wounds on various parts of her body, including her face, neck, back, hands, and forearms. The most severe injuries were inflicted on her abdomen and chest, which caused significant damage to her lungs and liver. After inflicting injuries on himself, Jonathan spent 8 days in the hospital recovering. On April 30, 2013, while still recovering and wearing bandages on both wrists, he was transported on a stretcher to a Wake County magistrate's office. There, he was officially charged with first-degree murder in Jaime's case and assault with a deadly weapon against another individual, Nation. Due to the severity of the charges, he was held without bail. Then taken to Central Prison in Raleigh, which had a hospital wing where he could continue receiving medical treatment while in custody. The sudden and tragic loss of Jaime left many people deeply affected and wondering why someone she considered a best friend would commit such a horrific act, robbing her of her future. After her death, rumors spread that a large amount of money had gone missing from the election campaign managed by Jaime's team. Jonathan, who had been the team's accountant, stopped working for the company at the end of 2012, but continued to provide financial information to Jaime and help with financial reports. Some people suspected that Jaime had discovered the missing funds, which totaled over $50,000, and confronted Jonathan about this. This confrontation might have triggered his violent outburst. On the day of the incident, April 22, 2013, Jaime had invited Jonathan to their usual Monday dinner to discuss the company's financial issues. Many believe that Jaime might have questioned Jonathan about the missing funds at that time. 6 months after the tragic incident, Jaime's husband, Nation, and her family scattered her ashes near the Pulaski Memorial Baptist Church. This church was a place Jaime had voluntarily dedicated a lot of time and effort to. A week before the tragedy. The irony is that Jaime had asked the church's pastor to pray for Jonathan, who was believed to be battling cancer. Little did Jaime know that their lives would soon be shattered. Nation had to come to terms with the fact that someone he had known since childhood had taken the life of the woman he loved. For Nation, Jaime was everything, his partner, his confidant. After Jaime's passing, the trial of Jonathan Broyhill began on March 4, 2015. The district attorney told the jury that Jonathan, Jaime's financial manager, had misappropriated around $50,000 from her account by writing 39 checks to himself. Jonathan made various excuses to justify his actions, including health problems from multiple sclerosis, memory issues, a gallbladder operation, and pancreatic cancer. According to Nation, Jaime knew about the missing money but chose not to confront Jonathan about it because his health is not good. Instead, she hopes Jonathan will admit his mistake and correct it on his own. However, everything changed when Jaime got a call from a debt collector. The district attorney revealed a shocking truth. A year prior, Jonathan's first hospitalization was a result of an incident at the Jaime residence. Prior to this, Jonathan had never medical treatment, which was confirmed by his health records. He had been deceiving Jaime and Nation about his health, falsely claiming to have had a gallbladder operation, multiple sclerosis, and cancer. In reality, his medical history only showed a mental disorder. Jonathan's internet search history showed he had researched pancreatic cancer and specialists in that field, possibly to make his fabrication more believable. He had also looked up cruises that did not require a passport. Furthermore, Jonathan had booked a one-way trip to Las Vegas for April 23, but canceled it on the 22nd, just 2 hours before attacking Jaime with a knife. Jonathan confessed to the authorities that he had misused campaign funds and fabricated his medical conditions. Although Jonathan said he needed medical attention, but he would secretly leave while Nation waited in the car. Nation did not know that he was deceiving them about his true intentions. Around this time, Jonathan was struggling with depression and suicidal thoughts. He was also experiencing auditory hallucinations, hearing voices that encouraged him to harm others. He had even purchased a knife with the intention of using it to end his life in Vegas. However, when Jaime confronted him about the financial irregularities, Jonathan's emotional state escalated, and he began inflicting injuries on himself. As the situation spiraled out of control, Jaime tried to intervene, but Jonathan's anger and delirium led him to attack her impulsively. He remembered attacking Jaime but had no recollection of chasing Nation. Jonathan's lawyer acknowledged that the evidence against him was overwhelming, making it impossible to dismiss the charges. Instead, they planned to argue for temporary insanity to reduce the sentence. On March 19, 2015, the jury delivered their verdict, finding Jonathan Broyhill guilty of murdering Jaime Han and attempting to murder Nation Han, both first-degree charges. The judge sentenced Jonathan to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Hello again, true crime fans. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Ronald Platt. July 28, 1996, began as a typical summer day in South England. Captain John Kopek and his son prepared for a fishing trip on their trawler, the Melkerry. Despite an unsuccessful day, they decided to try their luck in a spot known as the Roughs. They lowered the net into the water and waited. The two men felt a tug on the net, indicating that it was a large catch. However, when they pulled the net up, they were shocked to find that it was not a fish, but instead a badly decomposed body of a man. Captain Kopek immediately contacted the Brixham Coast Guard to report the discovery. The body was in a state of severe decomposition, indicating that it had been in the ocean for some time. Fish had nibbled at parts of the body, but despite the decomposition, the man's clothing was intact: a long-sleeved shirt, corduroy pants, and brown shoes. And there was no identification on the body. The only identifying features found on the dead man were a smudged tattoo on his right hand and a Rolex watch on his wrist. The body was taken to the medical examiner's office in Devon for further examination. It was estimated that the man was between 40 and 50 years old. A distinctive tattoo of a cluster of stars was found on his body. His only severe injury was a head wound, which was not fatal. This, combined with other bruising, suggested that he had been dragged along the seabed before being pulled into a boat. However, his lungs were filled with water, indicating that he had ultimately drowned. Police suspected that the man might have fallen overboard during a ferry crossing. The primary method for identifying him was through dental records, as they would be on file if he was a British citizen. However, this process would take some time. It was by chance that a mortuary technician noticed the man's watch, a Rolex Oyster self-winding model that was fully waterproof. The watch required regular motion to stay active and, as an original model, its ownership could potentially be traced. Police examined the watch found on the unidentified man and discovered a crucial clue. The calendar feature showed the date July 22nd, indicating that the man had likely drowned 2 days earlier, on July 20th, 1996. Further examination revealed a serial number hidden between the wristband and the watch face. Police sent this number to Rolex to verify its authenticity and determine who owned the watch. The mystery surrounding the man, now known as Rolex Man, gained further clues a few weeks later, after a records search identified the watch's owner as Ronald Joseph Platt. Ronald Joseph Platt was a 51-year-old TV repairman born in Calgary, Canada. His family later moved to Britain, where he grew up. Ronald remained unmarried and had served in the British Army as part of his national service. Those who knew him well described Ronald as a quiet and introverted man with a deep love for his native Canada. Ronald bought a Rolex watch in Germany in 1967, which became one of his most prized possessions. Ronald was so attached to the watch that, according to his former partners, he even wore it in the shower. Detective Constable Clenaghan from the Devon and Cornwall Police was assigned to the case from the start. The police investigation revealed that Ronald's last known address was in Essex, which was hundreds of miles away from where his body was found. Clenaghan contacted the Essex Police Department for assistance. Inspector Peter Redmond offered to visit the address to help with the investigation. When he visited the house, Peter found it vacant. Peter then contacted the owner and was told that the owner had moved out some time ago. However, Peter was provided with a letter of introduction that could assist in the investigation. The letter provided the address and contact details of a man named David Davis. Detective Peter called the number and got in touch with Davis. Before delivering the news, Peter asked Davis about his relationship with Ronald. Peter then informed Davis that a body had been found in Devon that was likely to be his friend. Davis agreed to meet with the police in Essex to discuss the matter further. When they met, Peter found Davis to be friendly and confident, but surprisingly calm, and asked very few questions about Ronald's death. Davis and Ronald had been friends for several years. Davis hadn't seen Ronald in over 3 months, and the last time they met, Davis had given him a loan to start an electrical business in France. Since then, Davis had assumed Ronald was living in France. During their conversation, Peter discovered that the symbol tattooed on Ronald's hand was a maple leaf, the national symbol of Canada. After providing all the necessary information, Davis left the station, assuring Detective Peter that he would send a photo of Ronald. The Essex police were then able to conclude their investigation, forming the theory that Ronald had fallen overboard and drowned in the channel. This theory aligned with Davis's account of the events, suggesting it was simply an unfortunate accident. With the Essex case over, Clenaghan had a problem on his end. He tried to contact Davis several times but was unsuccessful. Clenaghan then asked his colleague, Detective Peter of Essex, to help him contact Davis. Peter agreed and visited Davis at his home in Wooden Walter, a rural area of Essex with only 4 houses. They continued to describe Ronald to Peter, and he suddenly realized that the man they were describing was none other than the recently deceased Ronald Platt. This sudden revelation aroused Peter's suspicions, and he quickly contacted Clenahan in Devon to share this surprising discovery. Police from both counties began to suspect that there was more to the case than initially appeared. Peter turned his attention to gathering information about the man impersonating his deceased friend. Peter visited an elderly couple, Frank and Aubrey, who shared with him the story of Ronald Platt, a young man with a wife and 2 young children. The couple mentioned that Ronald and his family frequently vacationed in Devon, where they owned a yacht, although they could not remember the name of the yacht. In Devon, Clenahan reviewed the evidence and began re-interrogating old witnesses. His first was John Coppock, who revealed that when Ronald's body was found, a 10-pound anchor had also been pulled up in the net. John Coppock had given the anchor to a friend, who then passed it on to his mother to sell. Fortunately, the anchor had not yet been sold, allowing the police to retrieve it as evidence. Clenahan's next step was to interview people who knew Ronald. He contacted Ronald's brother, Brian. Brian mentioned Elaine Boyes, Ronald's old friend of 13 years. Police then spoke with Elaine Boyes and discovered the connection between Ronald Platt and Davis. Elaine Boyes had met Davis in 1991 while working as a receptionist at a fine arts auction house in Harrogate, England. She recalled Davis as being tall, engaging, and charming. During their conversation, Davis mentioned his plans to move to Yorkshire, and the topic turned to job opportunities. Davis offered Elaine Boyes a job at his company, but she declined, explaining that she and Ronald were planning to move to Canada soon. Davis offered to help Elaine Boyes and Ronald save money to move to Canada. Elaine Boyes soon became Davis's executive assistant, and she soon introduced Ronald to Davis. The 2 men quickly became close friends. Elaine Boyes and Ronald were fascinated by Davis's lavish stories and impressed by his lavish lifestyle. Davis then offered them a business opportunity, proposing that they become directors of his company, the Cavendish Corporation. Although Elaine Boyes was initially hesitant, Davis explained that he wanted to keep a low profile due to his ex-wife, a wealthy doctor in New York, who allegedly still demanded alimony payments from him. By this point, Elaine Boyes and Ronald had developed a trust in Davis and believed that he was genuinely trying to protect her from his ex-wife. Davis sent both Elaine Boyes and Platt on business trips to Europe to negotiate deals on his behalf, gradually drawing them into his scheme. They transferred money to various offshore bank accounts without asking Davis what he intended to do with it, trusting him greatly because of his religious nature. On Christmas Day 1992, Davis invited Elaine Boyes and Ronald to visit Davis and his daughter, Noelle. After a sumptuous meal, they exchanged gifts. Elaine Boyes presented Davis with a card titled "The Greatest Gift Ever." In return, Davis gave the couple 2 plane tickets to Canada, provided they used them before February 1993. While Elaine Boyes was overwhelmed by the short notice, Ronald was overjoyed that his lifelong dream of returning to Canada had finally come true thanks to Davis. In preparation for their upcoming trip, Davis quickly made arrangements. To ensure he could effectively manage their affairs while they were away, he asked Elaine Boyes and Ronald to stamp their signatures and leave their driver's licenses with him in case they needed to prove their identity. Elaine Boyes and Ronald agreed, as they trusted Davis and were grateful for the new beginning he provided. Consequently, in February 1993, they left for Canada. However, the harsh winter conditions, lack of job opportunities, and resulting financial strain quickly put pressure on their relationship. Elaine Boyes and Ronald's relationship began to unravel due to increasing tension, ultimately causing them to drift apart. 5 months later, Elaine Boyes traveled to England to serve as a bridesmaid at her sister's wedding, with no intention of returning to Canada. Davis, who had become a family friend, was also invited to the wedding. During the event, he spoke with Elaine Boyes and asked about Ronald. Upon learning that Elaine Boyes had ended her relationship with Ronald and would not be returning to Canada, Davis was upset. He attempted to persuade Elaine Boyes to give Ronald another chance, but she refused. Davis packed up his life, said goodbye to Elaine Boyes, and left her with his mobile number. However, their friendship eventually dissolved, and the phone calls ceased. Ronald and Elaine Boyes had lost contact. Ever since Elaine Boyes moved away from Canada, she had not heard from Ronald, her former lover, or Davis, who had been her best friend. So when Davis suddenly contacted Elaine Boyes in late 1996, their conversation was somewhat awkward. They barely exchanged any important information, and surprisingly, Davis did not even mention Ronald's name. The conversation was brief, and they did not keep in touch after that. He failed to tell her that Ronald was dead. After the interview, Elaine Boyes suspected Davis was involved in Ronald's death. Police needed more concrete evidence. They started questioning witnesses. Following the wedding in Harrogate, Davis quickly moved to Devon with his family. There, he introduced himself as Ronald Platt. He also introduced his pregnant daughter as his wife, sometimes calling her Elaine Boyes. It was well known that Davis owned a yacht. Witnesses reported seeing Ronald and Davis together a month before Ronald's body was discovered. They claimed to have registered on Steam Packet as brothers, David and Ronald Platt. By this point, police knew Davis had lied about Ronald and his knowledge of Ronald's death. They needed one last piece of evidence to confirm their suspicions. Police analyzed mobile records and discovered that the calls made by Davis originated from the same area where the medical examiner believed Ronald had drowned. This led Essex police to plan a sting operation to arrest Davis on suspicion of Ronald's murder. The police were informed by Elaine Boyes that Davis had arranged to meet her for coffee at Chelmsford train station. The police arrived at the train station, however, Davis had escaped. Not giving up, Detective Peter decided to drive to the Davis family home. Pete called for backup. He speculated that Davis might be armed. As the police prepared to act, a taxi stopped at the entrance of the house, and Davis quickly escaped. The police promptly gave chase, and Davis was eventually caught and forced to surrender at gunpoint after Davis was arrested. Police took his fingerprints and submitted them to an international database. Albert Johnson Walker, a man on Interpol's wanted list and Canada's most wanted fugitive, was identified as the owner of the discovered prints. Albert Johnson's life story began in Canada. Born on August 9, 1945, in Hamilton, Ontario, Albert Johnson had big ambitions despite dropping out of high school. He had a charismatic presence. Albert Johnson met his ex-wife, Barbara MacDonald. They married in 1968. The couple started a family early and had 7 children, 3 girls and 4 boys. Albert Johnson was born in Paris, Ontario, where he and his wife Barbara started a freelance accounting business. The business grew rapidly, and within a decade, it had expanded to 6 locations with more than 30 employees. However, Albert Johnson deceived his friends and clients by secretly transferring their investments to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Over time, Albert Johnson's dishonesty wasn't the only problem he faced. His marriage began to fall apart due to his many affairs. Furthermore, those he had stolen money from began to become suspicious. With his empire on the brink of collapse, Albert Johnson decided to go on the run in 1990. Under the pretext of taking his 15-year-old daughter Sheena on a skiing trip to Europe, Albert Johnson escaped. Barbara discovered the incident and, concerned for her daughter's safety, reported her missing. The police tracked Albert Johnson to London, but lost track of him. Albert Johnson assumed a new identity, stolen from a client. He now went by the name Davis Wallace, and his daughter Sheena changed her name to Noelle. Although he evaded the police, the name Davis linked him back to his real identity. Davis Wallace needed a new identity, and his opportunity came when he met Ronald Platt. Ronald had a strong interest in Canada. Davis used this information to his advantage and created a new identity for himself. However, his plans began to fall apart in 1995 when Ronald contacted him, saying that Ronald was frustrated with life in Canada and was moving back to Essex to be closer to Davis. This development posed a problem for Davis, as having two Ronald Platts with the same birth date in the same area would have raised suspicion. To solve this problem, Davis came up with a plan. He bought a yacht, the Lady Jane, and took his family and Ronald to Totnes and Devon to celebrate the launch. During this trip, Davis and Ronald purchased a new 10-pound anchor. Davis invited Ronald to Devon for the weekend to go fishing and enjoy the coast. Davis took Ronald to his boat, the Lady Jane, far enough from shore to avoid detection. Once alone, Davis hit Ronald over the head with the anchor, knocking him unconscious. Davis then searched Ronald's pockets for identification and retrieved it. Davis tied the anchor to Ronald's waist to weigh him down and threw him into the water, intending to make it look like an accident. However, Davis made the mistake of leaving Ronald's Rolex watch on his wrist, which was later used to foil the carefully planned crime and bring Davis to justice. Davis's trial began in 1998. During the trial, some key evidence was presented to the court. The anchor found in the net along with Ronald Platt's body. Forensic experts analyzed the wound on Ronald's head and determined that it matched the shape of the anchor. Further investigation found traces of zinc on Ronald's belt, which matched the zinc found on the anchor. It was discovered that the anchor had been attached to Ronald's belt to drown him in the sea. A search of the yacht, Lady Jane, also uncovered significant evidence. Hairs matching Ronald's were found on a cushion, and his fingerprint was discovered on the bag that had been used to carry the anchor back to the yacht. Additionally, blood was found near the rails, providing further evidence to the case. Davis's hoarding habits cost him, as documents were seized and used to prove his sham business ventures and his trail of deception. Elaine Boy's testimony provided evidence that Davis would lose a lot if Ronald Platt returned to England. And his daughter Sheena testified that Davis had been out on a yacht and looked disheveled and agitated when he returned later that day of the murder. Sheena also spoke candidly about life with Davis and how she was constantly harassed by her father and feared for her own safety. Supreme Court Justice Neil Butterfield said Davis was an extremely intelligent and ruthless individual who posed a threat to others. He stated that Davis's crimes were carefully planned and executed with precision. As a result, Davis was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. In 2005, he was allowed to move to Canada to serve his sentence. 2 years later, at the age of 61, Davis was given an additional 4-year sentence to be served concurrently. In 2015, Davis applied for parole but withdrew it at the last minute. Hello again, true crime fans. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Dawn Hatcheney. Dawn Marie Hatcheney was born on December 5, 1969, in Seattle, Washington. She is the eldest child and only daughter of Donald Hatcheney and Diana Parle. Her father worked in a shipyard, while her mother was a homemaker. Dawn grew up with her 3 brothers, Dennis, Darren, and Derek, in Bremerton, Washington. Dawn developed a strong faith from an early age. According to her mother, she accepted God into her life at the age of 4. However, her childhood was also challenging. Her parents struggled with anxiety and depression, which often led to frequent conflicts at home. When Dawn was about 11 years old, her mother, Diana, left the family for another man. This new relationship resulted in the birth of another child. However, the relationship did not last, and Diana eventually returned to the family, bringing her newborn child with her. Despite these hardships, Dawn did well in school, She worked hard to achieve good grades and overcome her challenges. Her hard work paid off when she entered the prestigious Scripps National Spelling Bee at age 12. This achievement not only led her to the White House, but also gave her the opportunity to meet former President Ronald Reagan. Dawn graduated as valedictorian from Bremerton Christian School in 1988 and then attended Northwest College of the Assemblies of God Church in Seattle. During her college years, she met Nick Hatcheney, and they quickly formed a close relationship. However, Dawn's friends were concerned when she called Nick her other half after only a few dates, as they worried that Nick's assertive personality might not be a good fit for her. They wanted Dawn to find someone who would be unwaveringly supportive and emotionally committed. Nick grew up in Poulsbo, Washington, and his childhood shared some similarities with Dawn's. However, his family life was difficult. His father, Dan, was often distant and busy with work, leaving Nick feeling neglected. Nick's mother, Sandra, was busy with home daycare and foster care, which left Nick feeling like he was not a priority to her. He even felt that his mother favored his biological siblings and adopted children over him, leading Nick to believe that she hated him. Nick struggled with the emotional distance between his parents, especially his mother's long-term depression and his father's lack of attention. As a result, Nick lacked emotional support and connection from his family, which had a profound impact on his life. Despite his isolation, Nick found comfort and faith in the Bible and Christianity, which boosted his confidence during his teenage years but occasionally led to social isolation due to his growing self-assurance. Nick and Dawn first met in college. Initially, Dawn's friends found it strange that she liked Nick because his personality was completely different from hers. She was outgoing and confident, while Nick was not. However, as Dawn spent more time with Nick, she began to change. She was no longer the confident, independent, and driven person she once was. Instead, she became shy and indecisive, often agreeing with Nick's decisions even when they were not right for her. Although their relationship seemed unhealthy, their love for each other remained strong. Nick proposed to Dawn on Alki Beach in 1990, and they were married on April 20, 1991. As newlyweds, they moved to Bremerton, where Dawn worked as a loan officer and Nick became a youth pastor at Christ Community Church on Bainbridge Island near Seattle. Nick had always aspired to be a youth pastor at Christ Community Church, where he had previously had a good relationship with a pastor named Smith. However, Nick gradually drifted away from Smith when he found doctrinal agreement with Pastor Robert Billy Craig. Robert saw in Nick as nothing more than a tool to carry out his plan to overthrow Smith and take complete control of the church as senior pastor. Meanwhile, in 1997, Dawn and Nick faced housing problems due to frequent moves, living in houses they had renovated and sold. Dawn dreamed of having a family and a stable life. To solve this problem, Nick found a house in need of repair in East Bremerton and planned to move in, renovate it, and make it their home. However, the purchase and repair of the house put Nick and Dawn in debt. Although their relationship appeared perfect, with Dawn being Nick's supportive and accommodating wife, there were hidden problems that no one saw. Dawn even joked that if she and Nick broke up, Nick would stay with her instead of moving back to his parents' house. Meanwhile, Nick continued to borrow money from church members, putting him further into debt. He embarked on an ambitious project to start a Christian youth camp. Although the project was financially taxing, Nick committed to it because he had a strong desire to do so. Nick's story was closely related to Sandy Glass, a parishioner of Christ Community Church. When Nick was trying to find the right land to build his youth camp, Sandy confirmed once again that he had great ambitions. Sandy Glass's life had been full of ups and downs. She had faced many hardships in her life. Her first boyfriend died of an unknown illness, her father died in a construction accident, and her brother struggled with drug addiction. She married Jimmy, a carpenter, but their financial situation was strained because the family depended entirely on Jimmy's income while Sandy stayed home to care for the children. Sandy also struggled with her spending habits, often living beyond her means. This led to frequent arguments between her and Jimmy. These arguments sometimes caused Jimmy to express his frustration by yelling or withdrawing from the situation. To resolve their marital conflicts, Sandy and Jimmy sought help from the church and attended marriage counseling sessions coordinated by Nick. Nick had been the church's marriage counselor for many years. However, some parishioners filed complaints with Pastor Robert about Nick's counseling style. They were upset that Nick often asked personal questions and ignored other important issues. His discussions often focused on sexual issues, ignoring other aspects of marriage. Despite this, church members trusted Nick because he had the support of their former pastor, Smith. They felt that Nick would not have been entrusted with this role if he were not trustworthy. In the fall of 1997, Pastor Robert replaced Smith as senior pastor. Smith and his wife then left to do missionary work in Africa. Jimmy's parents, who were also church members, disagreed with his decision to seek church counseling. They were skeptical about Nick's qualifications and experience in guiding their son's marriage. When Nick focused primarily on Sandy, they became even more concerned because they felt he should focus on both of them equally. The relationship between Nick and Sandy went beyond the boundaries of a normal mentoring relationship. They spent too much time talking on the phone, meeting at church, and even outside. This made Jimmy's parents feel that their relationship was inappropriate as they interacted frequently and acted intimately. Pastor Robert's wife, Pamela, also noticed Nick's behavior and spoke to him privately. She expressed her concerns about his inappropriate behavior and advised him to focus on his own marriage. When complaints about Sandy and Nick's relationship arose, Robert had to intervene. He warned Sandy that her relationship with Nick was unacceptable and needed to end immediately. However, Sandy felt that she had a special connection with Nick. She wrote a letter to Robert, expressing her anger and frustration. In the letter, she stated that she felt Robert did not trust her. The relationship between Sandy and Nick had a negative impact on those around them. Dawn and Jimmy, along with Jimmy and Sandy's children, felt hurt by this. At one point, one of their children told Jimmy that Sandy and Nick had talked about Nick becoming their new father when Jimmy died. At church, Dawn began to share her grief with her friends. She told them about her financial situation and her desire to have children, but Nick was against the idea. By the end of 1997, Nick was romantically involved with several women besides Sandy. He spent time with them in private and on phone calls that lasted for hours. However, Sandy dreamed of the beautiful future she hoped to have with Nick. She encouraged him to invest more in the plan to open a youth camp and develop a romantic relationship with her. She believed that both of them were brought together by fate. A group of women in the congregation had tried to clear things up with Dawn, letting her know that the problems in her marriage with Nick had not been her fault, but rather Nick himself. However, her life had not turned out the way she had expected when she had married him. Back on Christmas, Dawn had woken up feeling unwell. Still, she and Nick had decided to visit her family and spend the day together. Later that evening, they had gone to Smith's house and spent time with his family. Early the next morning, the 26th, Nick had planned to go hunting with Lindsay Smith's daughter and her friends. Before leaving, Nick had met his friends at the Hood Canal Bridge in Jefferson County. After a few hours in the woods without catching anything, they had decided to return and have breakfast at a local diner around 9 a.m. While everyone was eating, Nick had suddenly become concerned and said that Dawn and he had not opened their Christmas presents. Around 9:30 a.m., Nick had left the diner and returned home. At 10 a.m., he had discovered that his wife had died in a fire. Investigators had discovered that the fire had initially started in Nick and Dawn's bedroom due to a faulty space heater. The space heater had burned fiercely and quickly spread due to the presence of newspapers and wrapping paper in the room. The situation had been made worse by the presence of multiple propane tanks on the floor. There had been a surprising detail in the story. Less than an hour earlier, Nick had told his friends at the diner that he and Dawn had not opened their Christmas presents. However, when he had spoken to the authorities, he had said that they had opened the presents the night before. Nick had explained that his wife, Dawn, had been feeling unwell and had gone to bed. He also had said he had received a propane tank as a Christmas gift. Because they had frequently renovated their home, they had to use a space heater during the winter. This type of heater often lacks modern safety features, leading to fires and deaths. The police had found no evidence that Nick's story had been false. As a local pastor, Nick had been well respected in the community and there had been no reason to suspect him of any involvement in his wife's death. Nick's congregation had tried to support him during what they had believed was a difficult time. Pastor Robert had suggested a way to try to ease Dawn's grief through prayer. However, Nick had rejected the idea, saying he had wanted Dawn to not experience any more pain. This rejection had surprised Pastor Robert, as Nick had previously been actively involved in church activities, including exorcisms. Mary Glass, Sandra's mother-in-law, had soon become suspicious of Nick's role in Dawn's death. She had thought that Dawn's death had not been an accident. She had urged her husband to contact the police to investigate, but this had not happened. Shortly thereafter, the police had determined that Dawn's death had been an accident and the case had been turned over to Nick's insurance company. Nick had received a large sum of money from his life insurance policy. This had been a bit strange to his friends and family, but they had later understood that Nick and Dawn's large debts and Nick's desire to build a youth camp had made him need the money. Some church members had found Nick's way of grieving for Dawn unusual, but they had not voiced their concerns because they had thought that people process grief differently. The church community then had held a celebration of Dawn's life, where family and friends had gathered to share stories about her and remember her life. During the celebration, Nick had shown remarkable composure throughout the funeral. Additionally, friends who had been helping clean Nick's house had discovered pictures of Dawn hidden in the back of a closet. This had suggested that Nick had wanted to remove memories of Dawn. Nick also had begun to show a cold and indifferent attitude towards many people, including some church members, neighbors, and friends. Nick's behavior had become even more suspicious when he had quickly developed a close relationship with Dawn's mother, Diana, under the guise of mourning his widowhood. This had shocked and outraged many. Even Pastor Robert could not stand Nick's behavior and had asked him to leave Christ Community Church. This expulsion had been a huge blow to Nick and marked the beginning of troubles in his life. On April 10, 2001, Sandy and her attorney met with the district attorney to negotiate her plea. In exchange for immunity, she had to reveal a secret that had been kept since the morning of December 26. Sandy recounted that on the morning of Dawn's death, Nick contacted her and said, "I did it." However, the conversation was interrupted by another call from the church informing her of Dawn's death. After the call ended, Sandy turned to Nick to clarify what he meant, but Nick simply said, "It's over, it's over." After several weeks, Sandy confronted Nick. At this point, he confessed to his crime. He had overdosed Dawn with Benadryl and then covered her face with a plastic bag to suffocate her. Dawn was still semi-conscious and had to watch as Nick murdered her. After making sure Dawn was dead, Nick arranged the crime scene to make it look like an accidental fire. He placed old newspapers and wrapping paper around the room, underneath Dawn's body, and placed propane tanks near the bed. He also arranged the fireplace to cause a fire in order to erase any evidence of his crime. Dawn's autopsy revealed no soot or carbon monoxide in her lungs or blood. However, this result did not accurately reflect reality because Dawn's red blood cells showed signs of carbon monoxide. The person in charge of Dawn's autopsy concluded that her death was an accidental fire, ignoring important evidence. One reason for this conclusion was that since Dawn was the wife of a pastor, it was thought that Dawn could not have been involved in any adulterous behavior. Although carbon monoxide bound to red blood cells, an autopsy revealed that Dawn did not inhale smoke. However, she had overdosed on the drug Benadryl, 5 times the normal dose. Some believe that this dose was not enough to cause respiratory failure. The pathologist also suggested that even if she had been asleep, Dawn would have reacted to the increased temperatures of the fire. Interestingly, crime scene photos showed newspapers underneath Dawn's body, but this detail was largely overlooked. Nick was finally arrested on September 12, 2001, in the Kinko's parking lot and vehemently denied any involvement in Dawn's death. Nick still faced a first-degree murder charge. His bail was set at $750,000. Sandy's testimony to investigators added to the frustration with the police over the nearly 4-year delay in considering Nick a suspect or making an arrest. Sandy cooperated with investigators because she was angry that Nick had relationships with other women in the church and felt taken advantage of. She believed that God did not approve of their relationship and that therefore Dawn's murder was against God's will. Church members who were questioned described Nick's strange behavior and inappropriate relationships. They also expressed frustration that he did not buy Dawn a tombstone after receiving the life insurance money. On September 17, 2001, Nick appeared in court and pleaded not guilty. He alleged that the church had cursed him and that Pastor Robert was a much more evil influence than the police could understand. Nick's trial then began. Nick was initially charged with first-degree murder, but the charges were amended to aggravated first-degree murder, which carried a sentence of life in prison without parole. Witnesses who testified included women who had relationships with Nick and several church members who had confided in him. They provided information that helped the jury better understand Nick. They had shared details of experiences they believed involved visions and direct messages from God, but in reality, Nick had used these to rationalize and manipulate others. Smith's daughter testified, describing how she had been introduced to Nick through her father and how Nick had taken advantage of her during her teenage years. The sexual relationship between her and Nick had begun shortly after Dawn had died and continued until she had moved away about a year later. Doctors and forensic experts had also testified, noting that Dawn's body had contained important clues regarding the events of that day. However, these clues had been ignored because Nick had been a pastor. Although there had been no signs of soot or carbon monoxide, which would have been unusual for a living, breathing person in a fire, the defense had vigorously contested these allegations. They had focused their efforts on portraying Nick's ex-partner, Sandy, as a jealous and vengeful man who had fabricated the accusations when he had discovered Nick's affairs with various women. On December 26, 2002, 5 years after Dawn's tragic death, the jury had deliberated for a day before finding Nick guilty of aggravated first-degree murder. At his sentencing hearing on February 7, 2003, Nick had addressed Dawn's friends and family, asserting his innocence but expressing remorse for his actions and sharing his sorrow for their loss. Nick had acknowledged that Dawn had deserved better treatment and had been sentenced to life in prison. However, in 2007, an appeal to the state Supreme Court had resulted in a modification of his sentence. The appeal had argued that the original charge of aggravated first-degree murder did not match Dawn's actual cause of death, as she had died from strangulation. The defense had argued that Nick did not deserve a life sentence. Ultimately, the state Supreme Court had ruled in favor of the appeal and commuted Nick's sentence to 26 years. Nick would be eligible for parole in 2025 and might be eligible for early release. Dawn had gone too soon. but not forgotten. She had chosen a life with someone she had trusted, but that had not come true. Sadly, that had led to betrayal and her heartbreaking death. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Justine Valdez. On May 19, 2018, 24 years old Justine Valdez went about her daily routine as usual. After finishing paperwork for her residency permit, she went to the gym and worked out until around 4:20 p.m. Then, she planned to head home. Her mother, Teresa, asked her to pick up some bread on the way, so Valdez stopped at the store before catching the 185 bus to Bray, which left after 6:09 p.m. The bus dropped Justine off at a familiar stop near her rural home, from which she normally walked the final 15 minutes to her doorstep. However, when Justine failed to arrive home, her mother Teresa became worried. Teresa was used to Justine being on time and communicating regularly, but when she couldn't reach her daughter by phone or message, she started to get anxious. As the hours passed with no word from Justine, Teresa decided to go out and look for her. Teresa's daughter Justine was expected to return home by bus, but when she failed to arrive, Teresa became increasingly worried and frantic. She stopped people on the street and asked if they had seen Justine, describing her Asian features and the sporty clothes she was wearing. Despite several people claiming to have spotted Justine getting off the bus, her disappearance remained a complete mystery. Teresa's worry escalated as each passing minute brought no new information about Justine's whereabouts or safety. Teresa was overwhelmed by anxiety and eventually reported Justine missing to the police, in the hope that they could locate her. Detectives promptly started investigating Justine's vanishing and initiated a thorough search. They looked into her daily routine and questioned people who knew her to explore every possibility, including whether Justine had left of her own free will. Justine Valdez lived with her parents, Teresa and Daniel, in the quiet Irish countryside. Her parents had moved to Ireland from the Philippines in search of a better life and brought Justine to join them in 2015. Despite struggling financially, Justine's parents worked hard to support her education and well-being. Justine was a responsible and diligent student, studying accounting at university while working part-time jobs to help pay for her studies and support her family. She worked as a waitress in Bray and as a childcare provider in her neighborhood, and even lived in the servant quarters of a large estate where her parents worked as a gardener and housekeeper. Justine was known for being reliable, hardworking, and dedicated to her responsibilities. Given her close relationship with her family and her strong sense of duty, it was unthinkable that she would voluntarily leave them behind. Her limited social life and lack of typical teenage rebellion also made it seem unlikely that she would run away. Despite efforts to contact everyone who knew Justine, no one had any information about her disappearance. As a 24 years old, Justine had long since moved past her teenage years and was very close to her family, making it unlikely that she would run away. She kept her parents informed about her daily activities, and on the day she went missing, she and her mother exchanged 63 messages. The last message was at 6:24 p.m. when Justine got off the bus. During the investigation, a crucial tip came from Justine's coworkers. A woman who was driving by with her 12-year-old son reported a disturbing incident to the police. She claimed to have seen a man pushing a woman who looked like Justine into the trunk of a black Nissan Qashqai. This incident happened just minutes after Justine got off the bus, and the police were quickly alerted to the situation. A second motorist soon came across a disturbing scene. An Asian girl was sitting in the back of a vehicle, tapping on the window and clearly frightened. The driver was initially unsure of what to make of the situation, but after discussing it with his wife when he got home, he realized the seriousness of what he had seen. He immediately called the authorities at 7:20 p.m. to report a possible kidnapping. Around the same time, another driver contacted the police to report a suspicious Nissan vehicle driving erratically about 6 kilometers from N's car. Patrol officers quickly responded to the location given by the initial female caller. When they arrived, they found Justine's broken cell phone and a bag of bread on the roadside, which raised serious concerns for her safety. Based on this evidence, investigators believed that the kidnapper had targeted Justine while she was walking home from the bus stop. The kidnapper had tried to put Justine in the trunk of the car, but she resisted. He then forced her into the back seat and drove away to an unknown location. The suspect's black Nissan was immediately put on the wanted list, and a large search effort began, involving patrol cars and helicopters. However, the search was difficult due to the darkness of the night, and no immediate leads were found. When daylight came, the search resumed, and detectives re-examined eyewitness accounts and narrowed down the list of potential suspects. Mark Hennessy, a 40-year-old man, was identified as a person of interest in the investigation because his appearance matched the description of the kidnapper. Police officers visited Mark Hennessy's home, but his wife, Nicola, had no idea where he was. She told them that he had left for a drink after work the day before and hadn't returned. This new information raised even more suspicions about Mark, leading investigators to look deeper into his past. Mark seemed like a model citizen. He was a devoted husband and father of 2 young daughters, with a stable job as an estimator on construction sites. He came from a respected family and lived in a wealthy neighborhood with other young families. He had no prior run-ins with the law and appeared to be a pillar of the community. However, the police knew that people can often hide their true nature behind a mask of respectability. Police officers visited the bar Mark had gone to the night before to ask questions and gather information. The bar staff confirmed that Mark had been there, but only stayed for a short time to have a beer and watch a soccer match around 5:40 p.m. He left the bar in a visibly agitated state and returned around midnight, staying only for 10 minutes before driving away in his car at 11 p.m. After further review, it was discovered that Mark had actually returned to the bar's entrance to chat with someone before leaving again. A review of the bar's CCTV footage confirmed the staff's accounts of Mark's brief visits. However, this still left a gap in his whereabouts between 5:40 p.m. and 11 p.m., and investigators remained unsure of what Mark had done during this time. Meanwhile, detectives also obtained CCTV footage of the bus route that Justine had taken, which led to a disturbing discovery. Mark's black Nissan was spotted following the bus just 30 minutes after he left the bar, raising suspicions about his involvement in Justine's disappearance. As the search for Mark's car and Justine continued, it became increasingly clear that the incidents were connected, and Mark emerged as the prime suspect in her abduction. Despite efforts to track his cell phone, Mark managed to stay one step ahead of the authorities. He made a single call to his wife, telling her he would be away for a while, but refused to surrender to the police even when his family begged him to do so. The investigators learned about the encounter from Mark's parents, and as a result, they strengthened their search for Mark. However, Mark remained elusive. The police turned to the public for help, issuing appeals through the media and asking anyone with information about Justine, Mark, or his car to come forward. One person responded to the appeal, spotting a Nissan that matched the description of Mark's car. She followed the vehicle to Cherrywood Park, where she observed the driver closely before notifying the authorities. When the police arrived, they found a man covered in blood sitting behind the wheel. Mark refused to leave his vehicle, even when police tried to persuade him. He threatened them with a knife, so they had to shoot him to protect themselves. The bullet hit Mark in the shoulder. When police took him out of the car, he was awake but not cooperating. They searched the vehicle, hoping to find Justine, but she was not there. Police questioned Mark repeatedly, but he wouldn't answer. Medical staff treated his injuries, and he was rushed to the hospital. Doctors fought to save Mark's life, hoping he would reveal Justine's location. Unfortunately, the bullet had bounced off and hit Mark in the head, killing him. Further investigation showed that the blood on Mark's face and body was his own, and he had several new stab wounds on his arm and neck. The police speculated that Mark, driven by a fear of being caught, had used a knife from his vehicle to prepare for a confrontation. When they finally caught him, the officers felt a sense of disappointment. They had found Mark in his vehicle, but their main goal was still unfulfilled. They had not found the missing person, Justine. At the scene, they found a note, but it was difficult to read due to the presence of blood. The officers were, however, able to decipher the words "sorry" and "Pease Castle," which provided a lead in the search for Justine. The search for Justine Valdez continued despite the dim hopes of her safe return. As her anxious parents prayed for her well-being, a thorough search was conducted in a wooded area south of Dublin, guided by a cryptic clue found near a castle. The search yielded Justine's purse, which contained her identification documents. Unfortunately, on May 21st, the search party discovered Justine's body. The autopsy revealed that Justine had been murdered on the evening of her abduction, with manual strangulation being the cause of death. Further examination showed that she had been subjected to a sexual assault, adding to the brutality of her demise. Amidst the sorrow and despair, a disturbing revelation emerged from the toxicological analysis. Justine's body contained trace amounts of prohibited substances. The presence of these substances raised many questions, with no clear explanation for their origin or purpose. Add a surprising twist to the case. Test results showed that Mark had ingested a substantial amount of these substances, making the circumstances surrounding the tragic events even more complex and difficult to understand. Mark's life had been spiraling out of control due to his struggles with alcohol and substance abuse, which likely contributed to the drugs found in Justine's system. His home life was also deteriorating, with frequent arguments with his spouse over his addiction and growing debts. Investigations revealed that Mark was actively using the dating app Tinder, where he was pursuing interactions with multiple women, including flirting with them at bars. Furthermore, his DNA was found on Justine's body, solidifying the police's suspicions of his involvement in her abduction and murder. As detectives pieced together the evidence, a disturbing narrative emerged. The murder was driven by Mark's sexual motives, and Justine became an innocent victim in his sinister quest. Mark had spotted Justine while following a bus and seized the opportunity to grab her off the street in broad daylight, despite the presence of multiple witnesses. A thorough examination of the victims' and perpetrators' phones revealed that they had no prior connection or communication. They had never met before, and there were no mutual connections between them. This grim revelation highlighted the tragic randomness of Justine's fate and the calculated brutality of Mark's actions. Upon closer examination, the detectives' initial assessment of the case changed significantly. It became clear that Mark was very familiar with the route Justine often took, suggesting that her murder was planned in advance rather than a spontaneous act. Mark had been carefully watching her movements, waiting for the right moment to strike. The day of the abduction was a deliberate break from his usual routine, as he intentionally positioned himself at the bus stop, following Justine's every move until he attacked her. The local community was deeply shaken by the tragic event, as such heinous acts were rare in their otherwise peaceful neighborhood. Many people rallied around the Justine family, offering them comfort and support during their time of immense loss. At the farewell ceremony, heartfelt tributes were paid to Justine, and white balloons were released into the sky, symbolizing hope in the midst of despair. Some attendees wore pink T-shirts with Justine's image, a touching tribute to her memory. Justine's family eventually decided to return to their native Philippines to lay her to rest, seeking comfort in familiar surroundings. However, they initially stayed abroad for a period before returning to Ireland in 2021, seeking a fresh start and new opportunities. They relocated to a different city and pursued new careers, which allowed them to heal from the painful memories that haunted them in their former home. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Danielle Jennings. Danielle Jennings was born on September 16, 1978, in Columbia, South Carolina, USA. She spent her childhood in Stockton, Georgia, with her mother and stepfather. Despite her cheerful and outgoing personality, Danielle faced a challenging situation when she became pregnant at the age of 16. However, she was determined to be a good mother and had no doubts about having her child. After the breakup with Carl, the father of her child, Danielle gave birth to her son, Tristan, in 1996. At just 17 years old, she became a single mother. Despite the challenges, Danielle was determined to provide the best life for herself and her son. She eventually met Luis, a man who would become a father figure to Tristan. Danielle and Luis had known each other since they were teenagers and had been friends in the past. When they started dating, Danielle was happy to have found someone who could support her and her son. Luis took care of Danielle and Tristan, and she felt like her life was finally falling into place. They moved in together, and Danielle found a job at a landscaping company. She was proud of herself for taking this step and was glad to have found a sense of stability and security. In December 1998, Luis proposed to Danielle, and she happily accepted. At the time, Danielle's life was on the upswing. She had a wonderful son, was engaged to the man she loved, and had promising career prospects. However, her life was about to take a devastating turn. On March 15, 1999, Luis came home from work to find Danielle lifeless on their bed. Their son, Tristan, was at daycare that day. Luis immediately knew something was wrong based on the color of Danielle's skin. He called 911, and police arrived at their apartment in Norcross, Georgia. The initial information was that a woman had died and her fiancé had made the 911 call. This raised suspicions among investigators, as it is not uncommon for the partner to be involved in the death of their loved one. Luis reported the crime to the police at the apartment entrance, stating that the victim was 20-year-old Danielle Jennings. According to Luis, he found Danielle's body when he returned from work. She was lying face down on the bed, and when he turned her over, he discovered that she was dead. Luis immediately called 911. The police took Luis to the station for questioning, and investigators examined the crime scene. Danielle was lying on her back on the bed, fully dressed, with a ligature around her neck. The ligature was a stocking tied very tightly, indicating that the perpetrator left her no chance of survival. The stocking was tied at the back of Danielle's neck, suggesting that the perpetrator was behind her when she was strangled. The bed was disheveled, and one of the dresser drawers was open, possibly indicating that the perpetrator took the stocking from her drawer. Additionally, Danielle's purse had been rummaged through, with its contents dumped out. The police considered the possibility that the crime was a robbery that escalated into murder, but noted that valuable items such as cameras and jewelry remained untouched. The investigators considered the possibility that the perpetrator's goal was to steal from the apartment, but after encountering Danielle, decided to kill her to eliminate her as a witness. They also explored the possibility that the crime scene was staged, as the front door showed no signs of forced entry. After searching the surrounding area, they found no evidence. The sliding glass door leading to the backyard was locked and showed no signs of forced entry. Based on their findings, the investigators concluded that Danielle must have let the perpetrator involuntarily, or that the perpetrator had a key to the apartment. This led them to focus on Luis, Danielle's fiancé, as the main suspect during their questioning. Luis was very emotional about the situation, as romantic relationships can sometimes lead to intense anger and sad consequences. The interrogation began with questions about his whereabouts on the day of his fiancé's death. According to Luis, he spent the entire day at work, and the last time he saw Danielle was was when he left for work in the morning. They both left the apartment at 6:45 a.m., but Danielle returned to get something. Luis claimed that Danielle was worried about an important meeting with management that day and seemed a little distracted. He also mentioned that Danielle called him at 11:30 a.m. to ask if he wanted to go to lunch with her, but he refused because he had a lot of work to do. Luis tried to contact Danielle later that day, but she wasn't answering. He called her colleagues and learned that she had gone out for lunch but never returned. When he tried to call their home phone, Danielle didn't answer. This led him to leave work and check on her. When he arrived at their apartment, he noticed that the front door was unlocked, and he found a jar that made him nervous. During the investigation, Luis stated that they had a good relationship and were deeply in love. Luis expressed that he was depressed and felt that the police were wasting their time by interrogating him, as he believed the real culprit was still at large. Detectives interviewed Danielle's friends and family, who all confirmed that Luis could not harm Danielle, as they were planning a wedding and were in love. Luis's co-workers also confirmed that he was at work all day, which ruled out any possibility of his involvement in the crime. Luis mentioned that Danielle had been receiving excessive attention from her co-worker, Jeff, who made her uncomfortable. Investigators went to Danielle's workplace and spoke to her boss, who confirmed that Danielle had complained about Jeff's behavior. Jeff's behavior was making Danielle uncomfortable. He was touching her and interfering with her work. Danielle had made it clear that she was in a committed relationship with Luis. Despite this, Jeff continued to make Danielle feel uncomfortable. The situation was also complicated by the fact that Jeff was 40 years old, while Danielle was just 20. Danielle's co-workers reported that she left the office for lunch, but never returned, providing investigators with a timeline for when the attack occurred. This raised suspicions about Jeff, who was absent from the office during the same time frame. The investigation explored the possibility that Jeff may have attacked Danielle after she opened the front door to her home. This could explain why there were no signs of forced entry. Jeff was brought in for questioning to discuss his relationship with Danielle. During the questioning, Jeff acknowledged inviting Danielle to lunch, but denied any involvement in Danielle's death. He did admit to liking Danielle, but stated that he didn't engage in any inappropriate behavior that would justify her complaint against him. Jeff claimed that he couldn't have attacked Danielle because he had an alibi. According to Jeff, he was with another colleague all day, working on various issues and driving around the city together. This meant that it was impossible for him to have committed the crime. Jeff identified a co-worker who he claimed was with him at the time of the crime. Investigators met with this co-worker, who confirmed Jeff's alibi, thus ruling out Jeff from suspect. The autopsy report provided some insight into the circumstances of Danielle's death. The cause of death was asphyxia, indicating that Danielle was attacked by surprise. Investigators concluded that the perpetrator approached her from behind and tightened the stocking until she lost consciousness. The perpetrator then tied the stocking in a knot to prevent Danielle from regaining consciousness. The lack of defensive injuries on her body suggested that Danielle did not resist the attack. In fact, the only injury on her body was the ligature mark on her neck, indicating that she may not have even seen the face of her attacker. The police investigation at the crime scene did not yield any evidence that could help identify the perpetrator. Despite a thorough search, no shoe prints, DNA, fingerprints, or hair were found. As a result, there was no evidence to send to the laboratory for analysis. Without any new leads, the police returned to their initial theory that the crime was a robbery gone wrong. The police asked Luis to re-examine the apartment with them to see if he could notice anything unusual. After a thorough examination, Luis reported that nothing seemed to be missing from the apartment and all items were in their usual places. However, a few days later, Luis contacted the police to report that he could not find Danielle's wedding ring. Luis also pointed out another unusual detail to the investigators. The stocking used to strangle Danielle did not belong to her. According to Luis, Danielle did not wear stockings, which suggested that the perpetrator had brought the stocking with them. One of her friends mentioned her ex-boyfriend Eddie, whom she started dating while pregnant. Eddie was known for his violent behavior, and as the relationship progressed, he became increasingly controlling and domineering. He eventually forbade her to see her friends and family. The relationship with Eddie continued to deteriorate after Danielle gave birth to her son. Things took a turn for the worse when Eddie started using illegal substances, and Danielle decided to end the relationship. Danielle attempted to start anew after leaving Eddie, but he refused to accept the end of their relationship. His behavior became increasingly unpredictable, prompting Danielle to obtain a restraining order against him. However, Eddie repeatedly disregarded the order. Eddie's actions escalated, with him frequently calling Danielle, parking near her home, and even appearing at her workplace. Danielle's family reported that Eddie had made numerous calls to her in the months leading up to her death, demanding that she meet with him, but she consistently hung up on him. Detectives identified Eddie as a prime suspect and brought him in for questioning. He was hostile and resistant to cooperating with the police. When discussing Danielle, his demeanor became visibly agitated. During the interrogation, Eddie's account of his relationship with Danielle contradicted the statements made by her family members. He claimed to have never been violent towards her and denied any involvement in her death, stating that he had not spoken to her in over a year. The investigators suspected that Eddie was lying to them. To verify his alibi, they checked Danielle's phone call history and discovered that Eddie had been in contact with her in the months leading up to her death. The police needed to confirm Eddie's whereabouts at the time of the attack. Eddie claimed to have been working out of state as a tow truck driver at the time of Danielle's death. He stated that he was miles away from the Ashley Lakes apartments where Danielle lived. His employer corroborated Eddie's story, providing receipts from a motel and gas stations that suggested Eddie was indeed out of state. However, 3 days after Danielle's death, the police received a new lead that changed the direction of the investigation. During an interview with residents of Ashley Lakes apartments, a woman shared a disturbing incident that had occurred a week before Danielle's death. She reported that she had been awoken by a knock on her door, but when she looked through the peephole, no one was there. She returned to bed, but a minute later, she heard her front door slam shut. She reported an incident where a maintenance man entered her apartment without permission. She stated that he was looking at her rather than performing his job, which made her feel uncomfortable. This incident led to an investigation, and the woman provided a description of the man to the police. Further investigation revealed that another woman had reported a similar incident, where a man entered her apartment claiming to need to change light bulbs, despite her apartment not needing any new bulbs. The man made a statement suggesting that he might be in the wrong apartment and then left. The management of Ashley Lakes Apartments provided investigators with a list of maintenance specialists working at the complex, and only one matched the description given by the two women. This individual was identified as Calvin Oliver, a 42-year-old maintenance worker who started working at the complex in September 1998. When shown his photo, both women identified Oliver as the man who entered their apartments without permission. The investigation also revealed that Oliver had been working at the complex when a string of incidents involving stolen items occurred, including missing cash, checks, jewelry, and computers. As the investigation continued, detectives searched for potential connections between Calvin Oliver and Danielle Jennings. They discovered that Oliver had performed work in Jennings' apartment just a couple of weeks before her death. This revelation made Oliver a key person of interest in the investigation. Oliver likely knew that Danielle and her fiancé Luis would be at work during the day, allowing him to enter their apartment without raising suspicion using his master key. It's possible that Danielle returned home for lunch while Oliver was already inside. Calvin Oliver was brought in for questioning by investigators. Initially, they asked him about the thefts that some Ashley Lakes Apartments residents had reported. He denied any involvement. When questioned about Danielle Jennings, Oliver claimed he had heard about what happened to her but didn't know her personally. He admitted to doing work in her apartment, but the police lacked concrete evidence linking him to the crime. Just before releasing Oliver from the police station, investigators decided to run a database check on him. The results were shocking. Oliver had an outstanding warrant in another jurisdiction for failing to appear on a burglary charge related to the theft of personal checks. Oliver had a significant criminal history, with convictions dating back to 1974, including residential burglaries, armed robbery, and sexual assault. He spent most of his life in prison, which raises the question of how he was able to get a job at Ashley Lakes Apartments. This is relevant because if Oliver was in Danielle's apartment when she came in, he had a motive to hurt her to avoid going back to prison. The police detained Oliver due to an active warrant for his arrest, which gave them time to investigate his involvement in Danielle's death. As part of their investigation into the thefts at Ashley Lakes Apartments, the police obtained a search warrant for Oliver's apartment. There, they found stolen belongings from other residents, as well as Danielle's wedding ring, which linked Oliver to her death. 9 days after Danielle's death, Calvin Oliver was charged with first-degree felony and burglary. After his false statement was exposed, Oliver refused to answer any more questions and chose to remain silent. During the trial, the prosecution presented a different scenario. Oliver killed Danielle after she caught him stealing at her apartment on March 14th, as she unexpectedly returned home from work. The trial lasted 5 days, and the jury delivered a guilty verdict on October 13, 2000. The court sentenced Oliver to life in prison for the murder of Danielle Jennings and an additional 20 years for stealing her wedding ring. As a result, Danielle's mother and stepfather, Sherry and Philip Jennings, gained custody of her son, Tristan. Ashley Lakes Apartments was aware of Oliver's troubled past, but failed to conduct a background check on him. This lack of oversight allowed Oliver, who had spent most of his life in prison, to reside in the same apartment complex as Danielle. Danielle's family sued Ashley Lakes Apartments after a series of thefts, and the murder went unreported by management. They claimed negligent hiring, inadequate security, and death. The jury returned a verdict of over $13 million, plus $2.5 million in punitive damages initially, later reduced to $250,000. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Patrick De La Cerda. Patrick De La Cerda was born in June 1992 in Miami, Florida, to a loving family. His father, Max De La Cerda, was from Spain, and his mother, Patricia Ronza, was from France, and moved to the US in the 1980s, where she married Max and had Patrick. Patrick grew up in a supportive and caring environment, surrounded by his parents' kindness, mutual respect, and care. He was a bright, sociable, and friendly person who excelled in school and made friends easily. His parents prioritized his education and upbringing, providing him with every opportunity to become a worthy individual. Patrick's father was a skilled construction specialist who had worked in the field all his life. Although the family wasn't wealthy, they were considered well off by city standards. After high school, Patrick decided to follow in his father's footsteps by enrolling in the construction faculty. However, during his university years, his parents divorced after nearly 25 years of marriage. The divorce was amicable, with no conflicts or disputes over property. Patrick's mother moved to Deltona, where she remarried, while Patrick chose to stay with his father in Miami, where they worked together as respected professionals in the construction industry. Despite their divorce, the family remained extremely close-knit and supportive. They regularly kept in touch through phone calls and were always willing to help each other when needed. Patrick frequently visited his mother in Deltona, sharing his life updates, happiness, and experiences, and introducing her to his love interests. With his mixed French-Spanish heritage, Patrick had a charming appearance from a young age, making him popular among they. However, having grown up in a family that valued strong relationships, he never pursued casual flings, instead seeking true mutual love and a strong, loving family of his own. Patrick met Jessica on a popular dating site in June 2017. Although he wasn't sure he'd find someone special, he was drawn to her striking appearance and charming smile. Jessica, born in 1988 in Orlando, Florida, responded to his message, and they started communicating easily. She had studied banking at a local university and worked at a bank branch in Orlando. As they shared their thoughts and experiences, they quickly developed mutual sympathy and trust. After exchanging phone numbers, they talked for hours every evening for the next couple of weeks, building a strong connection. The young people, Patrick and Jessica, decided to meet in person after connecting online. Because they lived in different parts of the state, they chose a midpoint for their meeting. On their first date, Patrick was immediately smitten with Jessica and knew he wanted to be with her. Jessica also felt a strong connection, although she was slightly taken aback by their 4-year age difference. Thrilled, Patrick called his mom, Patricia, on the way home to tell her about the girl he wanted to marry and start a family with. Patricia could hear the excitement in her son's voice and knew he was serious, making her happy for him. As their long-distance relationship continued for several months, the couple faced the challenge of living far apart, only able to see each other on weekends in neutral locations. To spend quality time together, they would often rent a cozy hotel room in a secluded spot. They cherished these moments, but by Sunday evening, they would reluctantly part ways, returning to their respective homes to prepare for work on Monday morning. In December 2017, Patrick moved to Delton to be closer to his girlfriend Jessica, who lived nearby. He purchased a house in a quiet neighborhood and started renovating it to create a cozy home for when Jessica would join him. However, Jessica was unable to leave her job immediately, so they planned to have a housewarming party in early spring the following year. As the new year approached, Patrick decided to propose to Jessica. He set up a romantic surprise, arranging fireworks in the backyard of his new house. While Jessica was distracted by the display, Patrick got down on one knee and presented her with a ring, asking her to be his wife. Overjoyed, Jessica accepted his proposal. Patrick revealed that he had been searching for the perfect engagement ring for a long time, but couldn't find one that met his high standards. He settled for a decent ring from a jewelry store to propose before the new year, but he had already commissioned a custom-made ring from a jewelry workshop, designed specifically to his taste. Patrick's life was about to take a dramatic turn. It had been 2 months since he got engaged, and wedding and housewarming preparations were in full swing. Both sets of parents had given their blessing, and the happy couple was ecstatic about their future together. They were planning a grand celebration in either Miami or France, the groom's mother's hometown. But on February 27, 2018, concern set in when Max, Patrick's father, received a call from a courier. The delivery company had listed Max's number as an alternate contact. The courier reported that Patrick's order had been delivered to his address, but he wasn't answering the door or his phone. This wasn't like Patrick, and Max immediately felt worried. Since he was at work and couldn't check on his son, he decided to ask his future daughter-in-law for help. Patrick's father called Jessica, his voice laced with anxiety, saying he couldn't reach his son. Jessica had been trying to contact Patrick all morning, but he hadn't replied to her messages or calls. When she told Patrick's father, Max, he feared something must have happened to him. Jessica rushed to Patrick's house as quickly as possible. When she arrived, she saw his car in the driveway, suggesting he hadn't left. Using her own key, she entered the yard and loudly called out to Patrick, but there was no response. Jessica cautiously opened the front door and was met with a horrific scene. Her fiancé lay at the entrance, surrounded by a pool of his own blood, showing no signs of life. She immediately called emergency services, but the paramedics who arrived were unable to help Patrick and sadly declared him dead. By the time the police arrived, Jessica was devastated, sobbing in the backyard of the house where Patrick had proposed to her just 2 months prior. When an officer approached her, she pointed an accusatory finger at a single individual, a wealthy and influential ex-boyfriend. According to Jessica, he was responsible for murdering her lover and destroying her life. To make sense of this complex case, it's essential to go back in time to when Jessica and Patrick first met. At that point, Jessica was in a relationship with Gregory Bender, a successful businessman who owned an investment fund. He was 20 years older than her and had swept her off her feet during her student years. Gregory lavished her with expensive gifts and exotic getaways, and Jessica believed she had found her soulmate. However, she soon began to notice peculiarities in his behavior that raised red flags. Gregory exerted control over his girlfriend Jessica, monitoring her every move and conversation. If she had a male admirer, he would threaten and intimidate them away. Meanwhile, he was secretive about his own life, sharing little information with her. Their 8-year relationship was marked by Gregory's refusal to introduce Jessica to his family and friends. He dictated when they would spend time together, go on vacation, or visit his home, claiming to be too busy. Jessica longed for a normal family life, including having children, but Gregory always put it off, saying the time was not right. When Jessica attempted to end the relationship, Gregory proposed to her, and she accepted. However, nothing changed. They still lived apart and only saw each other when Gregory permitted. After Gregory was in a car accident and hospitalized, Jessica rushed to his side, but first she stopped by his house to gather some belongings for him. Jessica encountered a mysterious woman at the house who refused to introduce herself and instead asked Jessica who she was. Jessica explained that she was the bride of the house's owner, showing her engagement ring as proof. The stranger then revealed her own ring and introduced herself as Diora Sanchez, Bender's legal wife. Stunned, Jessica decided to end her relationship with the cheating businessman. However, Gregory begged her to stay, promising to divorce Diora soon and marry Jessica instead. Naively, Jessica believed him, but time passed and nothing changed. Frustrated, she joined a dating site and met Patrick, with whom she started communicating. Finally, Jessica mustered the courage to break up with Gregory, but he refused to let her go. Bender initially tried to win Jessica back by promising to divorce his wife, but when that failed, he resorted to threats and harassment. When that didn't work, he became suspicious and decided to find out who Jessica was communicating with. He hired professionals to hack into her account and gather information. After discovering that Jessica was talking to Patrick, Gregory sent him threatening messages, claiming Jessica was his fiancée and demanding that he break up with her. While Patrick remained calm, believing the threats were empty, Jessica was terrified. She knew Bender had the means to carry out his threats, given his wealth, connections, and large collection of firearms. Jessica suggested ending their relationship to avoid hurting anyone, but Patrick refused to consider it. Instead, they went to the police and presented evidence of Gregory Bender's stalking and threats. As a result, they obtained a restraining order prohibiting Gregory from approaching or contacting them in any way. Additionally, the court ordered him to surrender all firearms in his possession. For a period of time, things seemed to return to normal, and the couple, Jessica and Patrick, thought they had finally escaped the stalker's attention. However, Jessica remained uneasy and persuaded Patrick to install security cameras both outside and inside their home, fearing that Gregory might ignore the restraining order. Let's go back to the tragic events of February 27, 2018. During the initial crime scene investigation, detectives quickly dismissed the possibility of a robbery and instead suspected a personal motive, given the brutality of the murder. The killer seemingly had a deep hatred for the victim, The 25-year-old victim's body had 4 gunshot wounds, including shots to the thigh, chest, and head. The examination also revealed injuries consistent with a fall from a ladder. The body was found lying on the floor between the front door and the stairs leading to the second floor. The killer likely sneaked into the house and waited for Patrick on the second floor. When Patrick climbed the stairs, the intruder ambushed him, shooting him in the thigh. Patrick fell down the stairs, and the killer followed, shooting him again in the chest and then delivering 2 fatal headshots. The murder weapon, a rare and hard-to-get pistol, was never found. However, investigators discovered 3 shell casings, 1 on the second floor and 2 more downstairs. The 4th shell casing was missing, suggesting the killer took it as a souvenir. Jessica claimed to know the killer's identity, but the police initially suspected Patrick's neighbor, a U.S. Army veteran who had a history of conflict with the victim. The neighbor had been wounded and concussed in combat, which led to a mental disorder. The veteran was skilled with firearms and had access to rare guns. In December 2017, he mistakenly shot at his new neighbor, thinking he was a burglar. Fortunately, no one was physically harmed, but the neighbor was hospitalized for a psychiatric condition that worsened due to the incident. After his return, the neighbor stalked Patrick, accusing him of being a spy and threatening to expose him. Given the neighbor's mental illness and potential motive, he was detained and questioned. Although he openly disliked Patrick, he had a solid alibi confirmed by multiple people at the time of the murder. The investigation focused on finding evidence and provoking a reaction from the perpetrator. The initial theory of a robbery was quickly dismissed since nothing was stolen or disturbed in the house, except for the hard drives containing video surveillance footage. This made it impossible to identify who entered or left the house that day. Forensic experts found no evidence, including fingerprints, shoe prints, or DNA traces, at the crime scene. The murder was meticulously planned, and although the investigators were convinced of Gregory's guilt, he seemed likely to get away with it. To catch him, the police devised a covert plan, asking Jessica to lure her former lover into a frank conversation. Jessica agreed and called Gregory, yelling at him, crying, and demanding to know why he had committed the crime. However, Gregory was suspicious from the start and feigned innocence, pretending to be shocked when Jessica accused him of murdering her fiancé. He even expressed condolences to her, never cracking under pressure. The police were unable to provoke him into a confession or a false move, and without sufficient evidence, they could only ask him to testify, but not detain or question him. Gregory had honored the restraining order and seemed to have moved on from his past with Jessica. Daura Sanchez-Bender contacted the police with crucial information about the Patrick de la Cerda case. She had seen a suspicious notebook in her husband's office with a detailed plan of an unknown person's house and a strange algorithm of actions. Although she didn't think much of it at the time, she connected it to the crime after seeing a news report. The police searched her husband's office and found the notebook, but the relevant pages were missing. However, they were discovered in the trash can, where Gregory had carelessly discarded them. The pages contained a detailed plan of the crime, including instructions to avoid leaving traces. The records showed that Gregory had been stalking Patrick, knew his daily routine, and was aware of the surveillance cameras. Gregory tried to cover his tracks by disposing of evidence, but he made critical mistakes, including failing to destroy his records and underestimating his wife's curiosity. A 4th missing shell casing was found in a cigar box, confirmed to be from the crime scene. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, the prosecution had enough circumstantial evidence to warrant Gregory's arrest. At the trial, Jessica testified about her tumultuous relationship with Gregory, including harassment and threats. However, the defense strategy focused on deflecting blame onto Jessica, accusing her of provoking Gregory's actions and being motivated by material gain. The defense downplayed the evidence of a murder plan, suggesting it was just a fantasy, and argued that the search of Gregory's home was illegal and the shell casing could have been planted. They also questioned the identification of the gun model by Jessica. During a court session, the defendant Gregory Bender's ex-wife, Dora Sanchez, testified as a witness. Until then, Gregory had shown little emotion, but he suddenly became animated and unexpectedly declared his love for Dora. This surprising confession seemed to influence Dora's testimony, and she began to question her initial statements. Despite her earlier claims, Dora said she was forgetful and eventually claimed that, having lived with Gregory for many years, she couldn't believe he was capable of murder. However, despite the lack of direct evidence and the defense team's efforts to challenge the search of Gregory's home, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder after hours of deliberation. The judge sentenced Gregory to life imprisonment without parole. As the sentence was read, Gregory fixed an intense stare on Jessica, his eyes unblinking, and seemed to glare at her. This made Jessica feel ill and brought her close to a panic attack. Jessica Devani sat beside her late fiancé's mother, overwhelmed with emotion, sobbing, and choking back tears. Despite numerous appeals by Gregory and his legal team, all attempts to overturn the verdict were rejected. The public was fascinated by the case due to its shocking nature. A wealthy businessman brutally murdered a working-class man and tried to escape justice. Patrick de la Cerda's story has been widely reported, with Gregory currently in prison. Jessica finds comfort in keeping Patrick's memory alive and feels safe. She wears the ring he gave her and a special piece of jewelry he had intended to give her. She remains close to Patrick's parents, who have welcomed her into their family as if she were their own daughter.